Well, just because we said we start at 5:30, we might not have many. We don't have many members here, but I will call the meeting to order, and hopefully people will come in and we can adjust the business as necessary. Can I get a roll call, please?
Sure can. Alrighty, Director Engfer.
Present.
Director Leopold. Director McPherson.
Here.
Director Cassidy. Director Franklin.
She's on the way.
Yep.
She texted me.
Director Pollock.
Here.
Director Dillis.
Here.
Director Ferris.
Here.
Director Henry.
Here.
Director Stiles.
Here.
Chair Perry.
Here.
For alternates, Director Brown.
Here is Director E. Cassidy.
Okay.
In the house. You're over there.
That was a negative on J. M. Brown.
So far.
Director Baskin. Director Koopman. Director Hayes. Director Lind. Director Moran.
Present.
As a non-voting member, correct?
Correct.
Director Reber. We have quorum of 9.
Okay. There you go. Move ahead. Welcome everybody in the audience. So now is the time for additions or deletions to the agenda. Do we have any?
None from staff.
Okay. Now is the time again for oral communications on matters not on the agenda. Anything that anyone wants to share that you might be interested in? Okay, hearing none. Can I get the approval of the December 11th board meeting minutes?
Move approval.
Second. Any discussion? Anything from the public? You've read the minutes? Okay. All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Carries unanimous.
Abstain.
Abstain. You will hear. That's acceptable. Okay. Election of officers. We need to elect a chair and a vice chair and so do we hear any nominations?
I'd like to nominate you to continue being the chair. I think you do a great job.
Okay, I'll second that. Thank you, Lois. Are there any other who seconded it, but are there any other nominations? Okay, hearing none, would you like to vote on that one? All those in favor of getting stuck with me for another year, say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Okay.
I understand that was unanimous, correct?
I believe so. Vice chair, I think we should have someone from SLV, so it's either Director Ferris or Director Henry. Whoever, I would nominate either one.
I'm nominating Willis Henry to continue as vice chair.
Okay.
I second.
Okay. Hearing no other nominations, can I get a vote? All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Okay. Unanimous. What else? Secretary? Do I hear nomination for secretary?
I nominate Angela Franklin. Isn't she currently there?
She is.
I believe she is. She is coming, so I guess we can do it without her being here, right?
Yes, you can.
Okay. And do I have a second?
Second.
Okay. Okay. Lois jumped in. So second from Director Henry, Vice President Henry, or Vice Chair. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Okay, done. Okay, committee reports none, consent agenda none. So we move to our general information session, the groundwater sustainability plan elements. And it looks like 411 is the legendary GSA roadmap.
It's just there for your reference.
Okay.
We keep using that placement so it's visible and everybody can keep track of what activities are moving so that we know, unless anybody has any comments or questions, it's there more for your reference.
Okay, any comments or questions? Anything from the general public? Okay. Now we are going to get preliminary, oh no, not that first. We do preliminary project first? No.
No, I think we're going to do the groundwater.
The groundwater model update.
Right.
Okay.
So you want me to?
Yes, please.
Okay.
I'm going to pass this to Dave Stepos, our facilitator, to take it from here.
Okay. Hi, everybody.
Just a quick note for the record that Jeff Koopman joined the meeting.
Okay, so as with several of the past months' meetings, we are continuing the theme of both GSP updates and informational sessions. So it's my pleasure to introduce Cameron Tana from Montgomery and Associates. For those of you that don't know, Georgina King had the audacity to apparently accept an opportunity to go to Hawaii this week and go surfing, so she's there. I know she feels very bitter about missing this meeting, and I think we are too. So with that, what we're going to do first is get an update on get a status report on the groundwater modeling update, which is officially what it's called, from Cameron, and take Q&A thereafter. And then after that, I, with the assistance of several of your various agencies' staff, will be doing an informational session presentation on projects and management actions, which is, as you know, part of Sigma compliance. So with that, Cameron.
Thanks, Dave. Thank you, board, for having me here. Good to be here in Georgina's place. And I will be talking about groundwater modeling for the GSP. And the groundwater model is a very important tool for the GSP. The Department of Water Resources regulations basically recommend using the model for various aspects of the GSP, including informational aspects as far as about groundwater in the basin, but also as a tool to inform decisions for policies as you develop the groundwater sustainability plan to reach sustainability in the time frame over the long term. So the idea today, tonight, what I'd like to cover is update on the model improvements and compare it to the recommendations from the model review. The agency had the foresight to recognize the importance of the model and the existence of a model of the basins for Scotts Valley Water District, but did retain ECI to review the model and provide recommendations so that it would be appropriate for use for the GSP. And so we'll be referring back to that review and those recommendations, describing the improvements based off of those recommendations and some variations from those recommendations, as well as some improvements that we've implemented once we got into working with the model and recognized some additional improvements we think are important for use of the model in the GSP. And then we'll briefly preview the next steps for using the model. So with the model improvements, going back to the recommendations for expanding the model from EKI, and one of the recommendations that's hard to read on the screen is to expand model to represent an entire basin. So they had a couple of slides in a presentation from a year or two ago to this board about their recommendations. And one of them was to expand the model grid to cover the entire basin. And because the GSP is meant to cover the entire basin, the tool for evaluating the basin ideally would cover the entire DWR basin. And the model was originally developed prior to the basin boundary modification, so it did not cover the entire basin. So to do that, we did have to expand the model in 4 different areas. And basically the 4 corners of the basin, kind of the northwest area in the Boulder Creek area, where the Zayani and Ben Lomond Fault come together. The east area, east of Hester Creek, on the east edge of the Zayani Fault, at least in this area, between 2 different basins, the Mid-County Basin and the Purisima Highlands. The basin boundary with the Santa Cruz Mid-County Basin, if you go kind of to the southeast, and then the Felton area, which is the southwest area west of Ben Lomond Fault. The original modification request cut the basin boundary off at Ben Lomond Fault. The DWR modified the basin to include the Felton area so that all previous basins were included in this larger Santa Margarita basin. And so to cover that modified basin, we expanded the model. One of the keys to understand is that the model is not just expanded horizontally, it's expanded in 3 dimensions. At depth, it needs to represent the geology that we believe occurs under the surface. And so it's not just expanding the area at the surface, but figuring out how the geology should be represented underneath the surface. We expanded all 4 areas. I don't have time to describe the expansion and the inclusion of geology on both the expanded area and within the previous model area, because we wanted to make it consistent across the original model boundary. Show an example from the Felton area to give you an idea of what we did to expand the model. And so we used the geologic model, and you've seen examples from the geologic model using the Leapfrog software. And we use this model to extend the model layers. And the geologic model really helps us incorporate various pieces of information to allow us to expand the model. So the model is expanded in this Felton area from the previous model domain, the Kennedy-Jenks model, and these slides are referred to as the KJ model domain. In this area, east of Ben Lomond Fault was part of the original model. We're able to include the model layers from that original model, which are the various dots you see on this figure, but also overlay it and include cross-sections. So these are evaluations of geology by geologists who have studied this basin in the past. And we needed to expand the model to include the Felton area west of the Ben Lomond Fault. So we could look at what previous experts have described in geology in this figure. But we can also not just look at the cross-sections, we can incorporate different information in 3 dimensions, including previous estimates of geologic contacts between aquifers and aquitards, the different units that provide groundwater flow or prevent groundwater flow, specific wells where the geology from the wells have been evaluated, where different kinds of aquifers or different aquifers and aquitards have been identified, along with the cross-section, along with the basin boundary, along with the previous model layer units, all bring it into one model that we can look in 3 dimensions for figuring out how the numerical model should represent the geology. And so in this case, we look at both the area east of Ben Lomond Fault, even though that was already part of the model. We want to make sure that we're still comfortable with the representation of the geology in that area. So this is a view looking at the area east of the Ben Lomond Fault, making adjustments to the model layers there. But also, and then to the area west of Ben Lomond Fault in the Felton area for how this expanded area should represent the geology. So based off of the information, we can develop what the layers should look like west of the Ben Lomond Fault, including the orange, some of the Lone Pico, and for part of the area, an overlying alluvium. So this is an example of how we're using the geologic model to expand the model both horizontally but also vertically for how the geology should be represented. The model expansion also required adding to the stream network. So to different expanded areas, there are additional streams that are located in there. So we're incorporating those streams in the expanded areas in the model. And we needed, because surface water depletion is a sustainability indicator, we need to account for these new streams so that we can evaluate that indicator basin-wide. Another suggestion from EKI was to more formally simulate San Lorenzo River. So we do have converted San Lorenzo River to be part of the stream network in the model, so that we can simulate flows in the San Lorenzo River and evaluate surface water groundwater interaction for the river. Related to the model expansion was a recommendation from EKI to modify the boundary conditions for consistency with the Mid-County Basin. That was described in the recommendation to be consistent with the Mid-County Basin model, and it referenced the flows that the Mid-County Basin model simulated across the boundary, and how although those flows were small, like what the KJ model simulated across that model, they were in opposite directions. In looking at it further, we do want to be consistent with that boundary, but have decided that it's more important to be consistent with the conceptual idea of what that boundary represents than what that model, what the Mid-County Basin model simulates. And so we've modified the model to be consistent with the basin boundary modification for that boundary, which was consistent for both the Mid-County Basin and for the Santa Margarita Basin. And that modification described the boundary as being related to a granitic divide that provides a groundwater divide between the two basins. So on the west side of the groundwater divide, or the granitic divide that structurally causes the groundwater divide, flow flows west of Santa Margarita Basin. That's the concept. And then on the east side of the granitic divide, groundwater flows east to the Mid-County Basin. And that's the idea behind the granitic divide dividing the two basins. Now, in the modification, the boundary doesn't follow the granitic divide everywhere. You can see that to the east, northeast, our green line, the granitic divide, it does not match the purple line, the basin boundary. And that's because there's overlying aquifers in this area. So there's a Prisma overlying Butano formation that you see in Santa Margarita Basin. So part of that Prisma formation is more closely aligned with flow in the Mid-County Basin. And so because we could not have overlapping basins for DWR, that was part of Mid-County Basin. But hydrogeologically, the important boundary is the granitic divide that provides the groundwater divide. And so we've extended the model to the granitic divide because that is the geologic boundary, and define that as no flow. So that's consistent with the concept, as opposed to trying to take information from results from the Mid-County Basin model. We think this is an appropriate way to represent the groundwater flow for Santa Margarita Basin. Another recommendation that has showed up in various places was to update how hydrology is represented in the model and develop projected hydrology that is compatible with climate change. You heard from Sean Chartrand of Balanced Hydrologics last month about climate change. And so we have been working with Sean and the rest of the Balance team about how to incorporate the information they can develop about climate change into the model. And that means we had to change how the model is set up for how it can incorporate that information. And so just a simple schematic about how we want that to occur is that the climate information, the rainfall and the temperature, should affect the recharge. So rainfall provides the source of water. Some of that water evapotranspirates, returns to the atmosphere because of heat from the sun. And so those are the climate factors that should affect how much water is available for recharging the groundwater, and then also how much runs off to the streams. And the model really wasn't set up to have the climate drive all those calculations. So it would change the way the preprocessor to the model calculates recharge to more directly include that relationship. So part of it was to revise the inputs, including the rainfall distribution, and this is to be consistent with how the future climate information will be provided by the work by balance. And so previous model used data for specific locations. There is also information about that is gridded that distributes over the area what the rainfall will look like. And we're using that data set, which is called the PRISM data set, to distribute the rainfall over the basin. And this matches what balance will create for future climate, which is a grid-based climate change data set that distributes rainfall over the whole basin model. And so this does actually result in a higher amount of rainfall predicted for the basin, but it will be more consistent with how to compare to the future climates that we will simulate, and we'll be able to consistently compare what has been seen in historical versus the future. Similarly, also needed to revise the calculated evapotranspiration. The previous model, the KGM model, did not explicitly include a calculation for evapotranspiration. We had to back it out to see what was in the model. But because future projections will include temperature changes, generally temperature increases with climate change, we needed to be able to calculate evapotranspiration for those different temperature projections. And so we included that calculation in the creation of inputs to the model. And again, this is using data from the PRISM data set that distributes climate information over the area of the model, and so that we can extend it through 2018 for simulating the historical conditions, and it will be consistent with how we will simulate increases in temperature going into the future. The climate data are available monthly, so we did change the model to calculate results on a monthly basis. And that's important for a couple of reasons in GSPs. One is that the GSP regulations require presentation of seasonal highs and seasonal lows, and we look at things on a monthly basis as opposed to a quarterly basis, which the model had previously simulated results. You can more specifically define the seasonal high and seasonal low. And it's also going to be important for different sustainability indicators, for example, surface water depletion, where getting more specific within a quarter is important for figuring out when the greatest depletion could occur, when the lowest flows could occur in different streams. And so the input data now reflects that. And in changing the inputs for precipitation, we did also follow the recommendation from ECAD to improve the recharge estimator to better document the recharge calculations. And again, we changed the recharge calculations to more fully represent that climate drives how much water is available. And so that included revision of calculation of the runoff and recharge estimator, where we calculate runoff to streams in each of the watersheds. And this includes watershed areas outside the basin. So for example, west of the basin includes watershed areas of the San Lorenzo River. calculation of runoff is included in the calculations for input to what is the model simulates for the San Lorenzo River. And then, so the calculations have been updated, it will be more clear to follow what is actually being calculated. The recharge portion of it, the water available is distributed or apportioned into recharge and runoff, and the recharge is based off of different recharge zones, which are based off of land use and geology. So depending on the land use and geology, the recharge rates change over the different areas. So those were basically the recommendations from EKI we've implemented in our improvements and getting into the model, and also sometimes the improvements you make kind of lead to other items that appear to need to be addressed as well. For example, changing to monthly stress periods, making the calculations, having the model make calculations monthly, requires changing the input for pumping as well, which was previously input as quarterly information. So took available data to incorporate monthly data for public water supplies into the model. The other thing we identified in looking at it more closely is that domestic pumping needed to be more comprehensively mapped. Previously, the model included pumping estimated for wells at locations at available well logs. The well log database is incomplete, so we did a spatial analysis of land use and building footprints to identify where other domestic pumping would occur, and it added additional domestic pumping to the model. The other main change that we made that was not identified by EKI is that we've updated the model to ModFlow 6. ModFlow 6 is the most recent core version of ModFlow, the groundwater flow software developed and published by the U.S. Geological Survey. And we did this update for a couple of reasons. One of them is for numerical efficiency, and that's because with the complex geology of the Santa Margarita Basin, there are places where different aquifer or aquitard units don't exist throughout the basin. In previous versions of the model, though, you would have to have a layer for that unit even where it doesn't exist, and therefore make calculations even for that unit even where it doesn't exist. So, but there are areas where aquitard units, for example, the Monterey Formation doesn't exist everywhere. It exists in parts of the basin, it doesn't exist in other parts. And where it doesn't exist, we can model straight from the overlying Santa Margarita to the underlying Lima Pico without having to make a calculation where something doesn't exist. So this should improve the efficiency of the model calculations. The other thing that ModFlow 6 does is that it helps with the calculation of water budget components. This figure is an example from the best management practices document for water budgets provided by DWR. Water budgets are a very important piece of information to be included in the GSP. Basically, where's water coming from, how's it being used, where is it going. And this figure shows that best management practice is to provide the best information, is to show different components of different parts of the water budget. So, for example, showing for recharge by different source types. And recharge or infiltration is shown in the figure. It shows infiltration from precipitation, but also infiltration of surface water versus infiltration of applied water, of return flows from irrigation uses, for example. Or for groundwater extraction by different water use sectors. The groundwater extraction for public water supply versus domestic use, or from the domestic wells. And in previous version of the model, the output really aggregated all of the infiltration together, no matter what the source, and all the groundwater, no matter what the use. And here we can set it up with Model 6 to divide it out and provide more specific information in the GSP. So we're taking advantage of the more recent developments in the software to provide better information for your plan. So those are the improvements we've made to the model. The next steps are to take this improved model, which is uncalibrated right now, so it hasn't been adjusted to simulate historical conditions. The next step is to do that, is to calibrate the model, and that's to compare the results from the model and adjust information in the model so that it simulates historical conditions and results in a calibrated model. And this calibrated model is a tool that can be used for the GSP for providing information like the water budgets, but also as a planning tool to evaluate future conditions. So the model will be used to project future conditions by changing model inputs, such as climate change, such as projections for future pumping, but also projects of management actions, so you can evaluate and compare different projects of management actions as you develop your plan and figure out how to achieve basin sustainability in the 50-year planning horizon. So that's what we've done with the model, and that's where we're going. Now I will take some questions. What questions do you have? Yes.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. So all the changes you talked about, I recognize you haven't run the numbers yet, you say, but can you generalize about, might this look better for us than what the model was going to show us before? You mentioned at one point that the distribution of water would, it sounded like we'd be talking about having more water than we would have otherwise. So can I glean from that this might help us say we actually have more water than we might have otherwise?
Well, the model does, as I mentioned, simulate more rainfall, more water sources, but how that gets proportioned into recharge may not change very much because we still need to calibrate it to what occurred historically. So and then the previous model was calibrated to that. So it's just a matter of what is the input and then of rainfall and how we expect it to become recharge. It still needs to be matched with historical conditions like the previous model. I think it's what the change allows us to do is how, as rainfall is projected to change in the future, we can predict what the effects would be better. So I don't want to say that it's better, it'll need to result in a better condition, just because we have a process that results in more rainfall projected over the whole area.
Thank you.
So I'm going to facilitate from over here to help Cameron out. So other questions? Doug?
Yeah.
Bruce, go ahead.
Yeah, there's different predictions of the severity of climate change and all. And I don't know where we are in this model, how serious it is, or are we at the most drastic predictions, or right in the middle, or wherever those may be. I'm not sure. There's a lot to think. The world's going to end in 5 years, and it's going to take 105 years. So I'm just trying to get a sense of, in this model, are we kind of in the middle of that, or?
Well, what I've described is kind of the model setup and really focused on simulating historical conditions while setting up for being able to simulate future conditions. So what we simulate for future conditions is still a choice that can be made. I think what Sean presented last month showed the big range in possible future conditions. And what's important is to try to represent as best you can that range for planning purposes. But that doesn't mean you need to choose the worst case, because even no matter the case, it's not going to be right, and it's not going to end up actually happening exactly that way. And it just needs to be reasonable for planning, and you need to be prepared to adjust as conditions change. So what we actually simulate for future conditions isn't quite nailed down yet.
Doug?
That was my question.
Other questions? We'll keep with the board to start with, and then and or staff, and then we'll transition over to the public. John?
A couple of questions. That all looks great. Let me turn this thing on. Yeah, those improvements look like it's really going to be an improvement on the old model. One thing I noticed, it looked like we're not using PRMS at all, like we are in Mid-County. Is that
That's right,
correct?
yeah.
So all the surface water and all the runoff and recharge is all done in mod flow? Simulation?
Well, it's actually, when I described the recharge calculations, which simply is figured by this diagram, these calculations are actually done all outside of mod flow. And so the results are entered into mod flow. So rainfall, evapotranspiration, that's all calculated outside of mod flow. And then based off of the calculations using those inputs, we input the direct percolation of precipitation, the recharge, and the runoff into mod flow.
Okay.
So all the climate stuff is actually outside of the groundwater flow modeling software. And those calculations is what we've changed, but outside of mod flow.
Okay. And then if you talked about return flow and how that's handled, is that done within mod flow, for instance, either irrigation flow or septic system return flow?
Yeah, so the calculations of the amount of return flow will also be done outside of mod flow and then entered into mod flow, like the recharge from precipitation. But with mod flow 6, we can enter them separately and therefore can see the calculations results out separately. Yeah.
Good. Yeah, that sounds great. And then one last question. You said you had that plot that showed the various polygons for recharge, and you said that was related to land use and rainfall. Will we be able to project as we do predictions, will we be able to modify land use at all, or is that kind of baked into those?
It is possible to modify land use. I don't think we're planning to simulate change in land use in the future projections, but any of these could be changed to say this area represents different land use. What would be really hard though is to say, oh, we need to change the area. So it'd be best to say, okay, this area, this zone is now this different land use. You can change that. But if you were to say that half of this zone is now something different from what it was before that, that's more difficult.
Yeah, I know in Mid-County we essentially assumed land use would remain the same, and then we work with the climate and the extract, the groundwater pumping. Those are the factors that change.
Right, yeah, that is a way to approach it. And you can approach it one way for the plan, but this is groundwater sustainability planning is a long-term process. Even after you complete your plan, you're not done. And you will have both annual reports and 5-year updates to submit, and there are opportunities to make changes if you think that they're important to make.
Do you get a color key with that?
I think it was asking
It's very colorful. I'm just curious what each of the colors mean.
Yeah, I could not tell you.
I'd like it on a T-shirt myself.
Yeah, exactly. I have one of those.
Other questions from the board or staff? Oh, Lois, thank you.
As I listen to you, I can't help but think about budgets. Because budgets are a guesstimate, an estimate, and this kind of is what this sounds like to me. I understand it's based on this fancy modeling and so forth. But it only takes one thing to blow it right out of the water. And granted, budgets are for 1 year, or maybe you'll do a 5-year budget, but this is for, what, 40 years, 50 years?
Mm-hmm.
just makes me wonder what happens if we have another long drought, or it's just something that just, everything we've done isn't really what's going to happen.
Lois, you're referring to water budget or cost or financial?
Well,
budget?
I'm talking about what he just
Okay.
presented to
All right.
us.
Okay.
And it sounds like all like theory to me. I'm not talking about a water budget. No, since I always worked on budgets, money, that kind of stuff, it was just making me think about how budgets aren't written in stone. You have to adjust them sometimes, and I don't, you've got a new model. Is it tested? What things do you have to do to it?
Yeah, there are still things to make it, we need to do to make it a reliable tool for the GSP. It's not going to be perfect. We're trying to get to a point where it's a valuable tool for providing information for the GSP and helping you make well-informed decisions for the future. And that is the calibration process that described in the last slide. But as far as future conditions, I think that is input that we would be interested in hearing from, is like how conservative should the future conditions of, say, climate represent in your plan. What kind of range of conditions would be helpful in your decision making, because that range and that either conservative or less conservative approach can be implemented in the model.
So I think what you're saying is this, so once this tool is calibrated and ready to go, we could input a various number of scenarios into it, like the 10-year drought that Lois is talking about,
Yeah.
and then it would be a good predictive model. We could look at that and say, okay, and if we start getting a 5-year, 6-year drought, that gets inputted into the model and it kind of tells us where we're going, right?
Right.
Yeah, so, once it's all set up, it's a tool we just input new information into and it serves us.
Right. So it's meant to set up your ability to say, what if this happens with climate? What if this happens what if we implement this project or management action? What if demand changes in some way that we can predict now that might happen? And then as you do implement the plan, you can update for new information and then update the projections as well. So it's a tool that you need for the GSP, but it's a tool that can be used in the future also.
And we'll talk in an applied sense, albeit conceptually, but we'll talk in an applied sense about that in the next presentation, the PMA part. Eden?
Yeah, so just to clarify, you could say, all right, we're going to have 3 years without any rainfall, and then 1 year with moderate. You can stack years and plug them into this finished calibrated model and see how it reacts.
Yes, you could.
Okay.
That's not that specific scenario isn't our current plan, but you could. Our current plan is to take information about climate change projection that Balance Hydrologics is working on based off of global models, but any climate could be entered.
Other questions from the board and or comments from staff? All right, I'm going to hand it back over to Chair Perry to handle public comment.
Okay, so does anyone from the public have a question, additional question about what we've just heard? Yes.
I'm Gail Mayhead, I live in Felton. I think you could hear from the board this real anxiousness to get on with the trying to understand how things will move forward if we predict different kinds of climate change. And they have to be anxious to do this because they've got to start making some decisions pretty soon. So my first question is how long do you think it's going to take you to calibrate the model so that you can hindcast historic data?
Mhm.
We know that from what Sean said last time that they've done that in streams. So they've got that much time. So that's
Yeah.
my first question is how long do you think it'll take you to do that?
Yeah.
Then the second question is, and this rises from my concern of watching Sean's discussion last time, was that he was only taking into account, when he was talking about climate change, essentially the effects on evapotranspiration and recharge due to temperature. And we know, of course, that climate change just doesn't involve temperature.
Mhm.
It also involves seasonality, which could affect runoff. In other words, if you get all of your rain in big storms, more of it runs off and you have less of it soaking in. And I was sort of surprised that when he gave that presentation, he said he was explicitly not considering that. He was not really considering a wide ensemble of potential rainfall scenarios that could happen. And he also said that his model blew up when he got to about 5 degrees centigrade, and we know that that's actually not at all unlikely in a 50-year scenario. So I guess what I want to hear is how we're going to, when are we going to get to that point, and then how are we going to explicitly take these things into account, and where is the information that, the best science on that going to come from? I think you asked the board to give you input on that, and well, they're not, they're not climate scientists, so they're not really going to be the ones that are going to tell you how conservative or how, how you should do it. That needs to come from you or some other group that is going to give us estimates.
So for the first question, which is the easier question, but still difficult to implement, is that our schedule has us working on calibration for 2 to 3 months here, and to come back and present a calibrated model after that time period. As far as climate change is concerned, I think what I was describing earlier was, we want to be able to present what we're doing and how it fits into the range of climate change projections, and see for planning purposes how make sure that the board is, the decision makers are comfortable with how that reflects the wide range of potential future climates that occur. As far as the specific questions about temperature in ET, I thought, and I don't have exactly what Sean was thinking or is planning on, but that the temperature would affect ET, but I think there are still projections for how rainfall will occur with season, because we do need monthly input for the rainfall. And
It wasn't what you projected.
yeah, because what I was saying before is that you use information from historical about the seasonality. So if you're saying that we're not changing the seasonality, then that is true, but what the model input will still reflect seasonality. And so because it's harder to project how seasonality will change versus how total rainfall and total temperature will change. So it may not have those specific changes, but that's certainly something that we'll make clear about what assumptions we're using, so everybody understands the limitations of what we're doing. But we think it still will lead to good planning tools for this plan, and it's something that can be improved on as this group moves forward.
I would assume if we see changes in seasonality, then we can make that adjustment.
Yes. Yeah. So I mean, as data comes in, you can update the model and say, well, what does this mean for what we think will happen in the future? But yes, but as certainly we'll need to understand what the assumptions are going into it.
Doug?
And I guess to build on that, as we've talked about before, we can create any number of different assumption testing scenarios that we want to bracket the problem space, and that might be the way that we address some of these seasonality questions if it's not inherent in the model.
And I would assume, when you talk about a range, I would think we don't say, okay, here's the range, we're gonna pick this part of the range. We're always gonna know what the whole range is, right? We're gonna know that the top of the range is this, and the bottom of the range is this. And we're not gonna ignore either the top or the bottom, just because, you know, we may think this is the most likely. We're still gonna be aware of the entire range and its possibilities, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think you can take different approaches to it. You should be aware of the range of possibilities on the climate. But the question is, what is the range of possibilities that you test with the model? The model it does take time to set up different inputs to the model with climate. So you can't, I mean, you can, but it takes time and money to do so of every possible projection that's out there. So the question for what limited projections you do is that you can make a choice that you're comfortable with planning based off of that choice.
So you could pick top, bottom, middle.
You could.
And I'll be touching on this a little bit again in an applied sense when I do the project management actions presentation, and I'll be hearkening back to some things we've talked about in prior meetings about sustainable management criteria, and one of the terms, and I'll go back to it then, is the margin of operational flexibility. So I'll touch on that. Rosemary, you have something to say?
So I guess I think I wanted to say a couple of things about the climate change presentation that Sean did last time. And that is that I think it was intended to sort of give a sense of what the issues are, as opposed to say, this is the limits of the elements we're looking at. So I mean, I think the presentation was focused on the things that he was presenting, as opposed to this is all I'm looking at, and what would get ultimately integrated into whatever the climate change scenario is that we're to be looking at. I think the second thing is, I think it's really important for us all to understand that there's a 5-year review and update of these plans, which means that if something has happened in that period of time between whatever you chose for your climate change scenario that makes you want to change that either in the middle or certainly at the update time, you have a chance to recalibrate. So it's not a once and done, it's really it's a tool that I think we will continue to apply, looking both at the groundwater systems and at the surface water systems in our area.
Yes.
John?
Another thing that we're seeing with climate change, and it's projected and we're already seeing it, is increased rainfall intensity, which would tend to give you more runoff and less infiltration in a very intense rainfall event. So it seems like that would be the sort of thing that you could calculate within your recharge calculation, sort of increase the proportion of runoff, and that's going to have to be based on something outside of the model that we calculate it. But that's another way that we can take into account some of the changes, either observed or predicted changes in precipitation intensity or seasonality, is by looking at that, looking at that sort of thing and making those calculations.
Right, and because of the way this model is set up with the rainfall being included in the calculations on a monthly basis, a change like that would be required for assuming what if the runoff proportion changed in some way, this would be the result. And so it is possible to do sensitivity runs and say, okay, historically we were able to calibrate the model with this sort of runoff proportion from the available runoff, and what would happen if, for whatever reason, it could be rainfall intensity, it could be some other reason, the runoff proportion was different, and how does that change how we view what will happen in the future and how projects and management actions will work. So that kind of sensitivity certainly can be done.
Okay, yeah, we're still on the public time. Yes.
So this software, is it used statewide by most of the groundwater agencies?
Yes, the main family of software is used throughout the country, and in the state, it is one of the two main families that is used by different groundwater sustainability agencies.
So it's like a CAD program that's constantly being updated, and you're going to get a new version probably every year that may include some new features like that intensity of rainfall?
In this case, I don't think there would be a new feature exactly like that. With these models, the version, it is actually a decision and a somewhat major decision to make to change the version of the model software within the family. And so that's why moving to Model 6 is something I would highlight. It's not the same as going from, say, Office 2015 to 2018.
I think what she's asking is, when was Model 5 invented? In other words, what's the gap between 5 and 6?
Yeah, and it wasn't called Model 5, but it was Model 2005. So it was 2005 or so. So that was a gap for a major change. They're always doing little updates, but for the major change, it was the last core.
15 years.
Was 15 years. Now there have been intervening different aspects, but they've tried to compile them all into this core version.
But if I'm not mistaken, all those things that, like you're asking about, rainfall changes, intensity, those are variables that we insert into the program.
Right.
They don't come with the program.
In this particular version of the program.
I'm just making the point that if all the agencies are using this software, or some form of this software, there's going to be a pressure to update the software to make it much easier to input these other variables, I would expect, right? Maybe the new versions will come quicker as the pressure of climate change pushes everyone towards making better models.
I think that would be nice. I can't speak for the federal government and how they're approaching it.
Okay, anyone else? Sean?
Yeah.
I knew you had a question. The other Sean, we'll call you.
Okay.
We had a Sean here once. Sorry. Yeah, that's you. Yeah.
I'm wondering about the dynamic, not the mod number 6, but the basic database that defines our area.
Mm-hmm.
Is it easily adjustable? Say somebody sinks a new well for one of the water companies.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's going to be a major change.
That's easily adjustable.
That's easily adjustable.
Yeah.
And if we do change surface permeation, permanent water to move through the surface, then like we start putting in permeable surface everywhere in the county. We're trying to do that right now.
Okay, yeah.
That'll change that map up there a little bit, won't it?
Yeah, the easier thing is to change the colors, what each area represents. The harder thing is to change the areas.
The area
zones,
itself.
yeah.
Okay.
So the question when those changes get made is a change that is easier to implement? Does that still represent well enough what is going on out there that we think will be close enough to help us with planning? Or is it such a big change that we really do need to take the greater effort to make the greater changes?
Does this all come in a user manual that says, if you sink a new well here, all you do is, hit a Control X and type this in?
It's F7, I think.
Or do we call you up and say, we're putting in a new well over here and fix them up?
Yeah, generally it's the latter. It doesn't it doesn't typically come, because each of these models, even though the software comes with user manual for implementing, each of the models are really their own entities. So specific information for how to work with the model is specific to the model. And so in general, it's not something that is set up so that anybody can go in and make changes. Now, there have been efforts to do things like that, but I think the way things are set up now, it isn't set up to do that.
So when we do have adjustments to make, we call it to this database that defines our.
Well, I think what would we're working for the agency, Senator Bernardo, the Groundwater Agency, and should the agency think the change is necessary to evaluate, then we would evaluate it. Yeah. Chuck?
I'm trying to understand the calibration process, and I'm imagining that you come into this process with a physical description and belief about what the system looks like, permeabilities and substrates and things like that, and then in the calibration process, you're trying to get to a simulation of an historic record in some way. So, what is being adjusted in the calibration process?
The main thing that is being adjusted are the geologic properties. So how the properties like hydraulic conductivity that drive how flow occurs in the aquifers, or how flow occurs between aquifers across aquitars. And so, especially since we're trying to model a whole area of something we cannot see for the most part, we calibrate to what the results are at specific locations. We also have some information about what the range of those values for things like hydraulic conductivity and storage properties for aquifers and aquitars should be, and stay within those range, and honor other information about those values. But the idea is to change those values so that the model simulates what we have seen historically.
So can I?
In groundwater levels mostly.
Is it okay if I ask? Okay.
Yes.
So you're trying to basically learn what the aquifer looks like through the calibration process. So I imagine how if you go through that process and you actually understand, then you believe with using maybe the whole historical record how that works. Can you then take away some of your data? So take away data in the last 5 years or something, and recalibrate and see what numbers you get. And then use that reduced calibration in a way to predict the future and see whether it predicts the data that you didn't include in it. So it's like, you can change a lot of numbers on things sometimes to get data to agree with other data. And if you want to be sure that your changes are real changes, not changes that just fit curves in some place. And I don't know whether I'm asking a good question on the psychological sense or not, but how do you get to the feeling, and when do you feel like you're really close to having the calibration that will last? Mm-hmm. And another question maybe is related. Once you've done one calibration, how much work is it to do another one? Okay, can you do that with a reduced data set without spending another, equivalent amount of time, doing that calibration?
So our general approach is to calibrate to all available data, and that, I think your question is one that comes up a lot, and it's definitely where this idea of setting up to validate your calibration is one that's done. But given available resources, we really want to focus on calibrating to all the data. And I think we also recognize that calibration very well may not last, that as you get new data, you may need to recalibrate. You're starting from a better starting point, I think, when you get that new data. So it should take less to recalibrate. But it is still, I think, can be a significant effort. I think our approach is to try to have the model represent the available data. The other approach that can also, the way can thought of is what is the uncertainty of the calibration, and therefore, based off of all available data, and what does that mean for the uncertainty of your predictions? And so there are ways to evaluate that as well. Because even we're not going to get a perfect match about all the data. There are definitely going to be data points and locations where the model does not simulate what we have observed. And we'll say, well, we got most of the rest well matched. We can't explain this part. So when we look at model results for that part, we'll say we can't really rely on that part. We have to focus on where we do have good results, and we have to focus on trying to get the good match where most of the project's management actions occur, or most of the management decisions will occur. And so that's the way it's going to be, because that's just my experience, that it's not going to be perfect. And so it's just important to understand, like, where is the model performing better and where is it not, but also even where it's performing well, what is the uncertainty of that? How does the error translate? Because there is going to be some error in how what the model simulates versus the observed. How does that translate into the uncertainty of our predictions?
Thank you.
Anyone else from our public audience? So we can get rid of close that time. But he's not public, he's staff. Yes.
Are the proposals for projects dependent on the calibration being done? In other words, no one can propose a project for 3 months till you get done with your calibration?
No, I think people can propose a project. We just won't be able to evaluate the project with the model until the calibration is done. I'm sure projects happen to flows, and that's fine, but for evaluating with the model, it needs to be calibrated.
Okay. So we'll close the public time and go back to board and staff. You are first.
Chair Perry, point
Yes.
of clarification. I know
Yes.
we've been over this a million times
Yes.
from all different angles, but when it's public comment time,
Yes.
it is my understanding that alternate directors that are silenced during board discussion can ask questions.
I'm going to ask
Correct.
Teresa that.
Here we go.
I'm gonna just quote it. I thought that alternates are not supposed to participate at all.
They can't be a member of the public, and they can't participate during the board time, so they're mute.
Yep.
Their volunteering to be an alternate renders them mute during public comment. They can't ask questions.
That's the bylaws that this board adopted. So if you want to change it, it's.
Does that seem right to everybody? It seems a little crazy. Okay.
Yeah, I'm not advocating that this is
Yeah,
right,
I'm not.
but this is just our bylaws that at that time it seemed like a good idea for the board when you adopted it. So we can certainly put it in a future agenda for you to discuss it and make any changes that.
My understanding was the spirit was that they wouldn't, like I had practiced, gotten myself into board discussion when I wasn't an active sitting board member, for a particular meeting or in general.
Right.
But not during just public questions on a presentation. That seems not the spirit of what we talked about.
Okay. Well, we can revisit for sure. John,
I was just going to add one other point to the discussion on calibration. Cameron also mentioned doing sensitivity analyses where you can test whether a particular factor that really makes much of a difference if, you know, whether you've got it right or not. For instance, in Mid-County, we adjusted the proportion of septic effluent that percolated, the percentage that would percolate into the ground. And we found it really didn't make much of a difference. I think we used 50% versus 90%, or was it?
That's my recollection.
Yeah, and it really didn't make a difference. So that's the sort of thing that lets you know that you really don't have to worry about spending a lot of resources to get that particular number right. It really isn't going to change what the model predicts for you. So you don't have to worry as much about those kinds of numbers.
Okay. Okay, well, that was very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Really appreciate your. Okay, Dave?
I'm going to quickly interject, just for the record.
Yes.
That we're keeping that Director Franklin joined at 5:41.
I got it.
Okay. Nice to see everybody. Hello. Nice to be back. Let me just kind of cover some logistics, if you don't mind, how we'll go through this presentation, discussion and presentation. Tonight, this is now moving into an informational session, as I spoke to earlier. What I'd like to ask is and what we'll be doing is, I'll be going through and really leading through, facilitating through this whole presentation. It's quite a bit of slides. The early part of it will be handled principally by me. We'll be getting to a certain point about midway through the presentation where I'm going to be very deliberately going to members of what we call the working group, which is essentially staff in the various agencies. That's why Sierra and Rosemary have now moved to the front of the room to be available, because I was going to call them my name if they were back there. John, Brett, and so on. So I'm going to be looking to them as they are quite literally the brain trust of certain specifics about conditions in the space and things that have already been speculated upon regarding potential problems, projects and management actions. They can do a far better job than me. So they know this. They're not going to be cold called on this. So what I'm going to be doing organizationally here is going through my portion, calling on staff to then be additive to it, fielding questions to the extent board members wish to weigh in during the presentation. And then, not unlike how we just did, go ahead and sort of conclude all possible feedback and communication and discussion by board members, and then I will be handing it back over to Chairman Perry, and we'll then be opening up the public comment portion. So I'm going to ask the public comment. So if I see members of the public raise their hand, I certainly understand that and respect that. I'll make a note of it, but I won't be responding to it, just giving everybody a heads up until we get through the informational session with the board. A couple of things as we, well, I'll just go ahead and just dive right in. No, anything else. Okay, so projects and management actions. We've talked about PMAs peripherally in past informational sessions and meetings as part of the overall spectrum of activities and things that must be done under SGMA. We've spent a lot of time thus far talking about sustainable management criteria and all the components therein. And I'll be referring through this presentation to terms that we've introduced and gone over in the sustainable management criteria, or what I'll call SMC portions. And again, the purpose of all of this has been to continue to make you as a board as fluent as possible, not only on the terms, but the implications and the work that you have before you as a GSA board. So that's going to be continued tonight, and we're just sort of continuing the effort. So what we're going to be doing tonight is reviewing the role of projects and management actions, or I'll refer to now as PMAs, in SGMA compliance. Discuss the timing and why we're starting this discussion about PMAs now, and we'll talk about that a little bit with you all as a board. We're going to introduce to you, and this is certainly one of the places where I'm going to really start looking to staff, colleague staff, about potential and preliminary problem statements, these sort of things that are the first place of framing what is the problem, therefore what are we trying to solve, what are we trying to get a solution for. And then also actually talk about potential PMAs that have already been talked about. And to give a reminder for several of you, because I know several of you in the room tonight, particularly as members of the public, were there. A year ago at this time, we were doing the winter workshop series. You'll recall that. We did the 3-month, the series each month. And in that winter workshop series was really the first place we introduced not only some preliminary lists of PMAs, but we did some workshopping about them, and we had some conversations. We gave you some hypotheticals as small group settings to discuss amongst yourselves as affected stakeholders. So some of this won't be new, but we're going to be doing further refinement on it. So that's the objectives for tonight to cover. So the first thing I want to do is just go right to the definition, and this is the first place where I'm going to start tying back to some of the other definitions. So what's a PMA? What's a project management action? Well, it's a physical, and I'm going to read this verbatim and then kind of expand on it. It's a physical project and or an activity that's done to eliminate an undesirable result and stay above a minimum threshold in one or more of the 6 sustainability indicators. Implementation of a project or management action must result in data that shows that the GSA has achieved and maintains sustainability. Okay, well, there's a lot of good gobbledygook. Let's go back and pick that apart a little bit. Undesirable results, to remind you from our SMC discussions and prior meetings, undesirable results of those conditions, the first thing that you're going to do is ultimately start identifying where conditions in this basin you as a board believe have significance and unreasonableness in terms of impacts to this basin. Okay, and then that's going to ultimately, and I'm oversimplifying this for time, but ultimately that's going to translate into this board defining undesirable results. Okay, and ultimately that's going to then be used for you to define a baseline of a minimum threshold, below which, if you fall below that minimum threshold on that particular sustainability indicator, you will be defined as and considered by the state as unsustainable. Now, to remind you, and I'm going to go back to a term I just talked about a little while ago because it has a bearing here. To remind you, you also, as a GSA, will set measurable objectives. So I want you to think, I don't have the charts in front of you, but consider it basically this way. A minimum threshold is the bare minimum. You must be above that minimum threshold. You will, as a board, set that minimum threshold. You'll do it with extensive data. You'll do it with all the outstanding work that your consultant team will do, but you'll ultimately set that minimum threshold. You will also set the measurable objective. You should think of the measurable objective essentially as an aspirational goal. This is where you hope to be. You've stated certain aspirational goals even within your guiding principles, so you've already started at least conceptually, the intent to do that. That space between a minimum threshold and a measurable objective, in Sigma speak, is called the margin of operational flexibility. And why that's really important is because this discussion that you all just had about climate and the uncertainty and the vagaries about climate, as well as lots of other things, is where you have to build in those uncertainties, and that's that margin of operational flexibility. And the underlying thing I want to say regarding all of that, just as an aside from this screen, is, and this is just my personal opinion, to be very clear, there is no manual that's going to tell you, and there's not a single thing from the state that's going to tell you as a board, you shall do this, you shall decide this. It will tell you what you are supposed to decide. You've heard me say many times before, local control, local control. And all of these decisions are going to be based ultimately, well informed as they will be, by you all making risk-based factors for this basin. It will be defensible, which is why, to the point that is this going to be costly? Is it already costly to do a model? Yes, it is. It's expensive, and it will continue to be expensive. Why? Because DWR will not let you go, oh, we think it's going to be like that, and you shrug your shoulders, and that's not going to cut it. You're going to have rigor and defensibility. That's why you're doing all the modeling. But above and beyond that, the other reason you're doing it is because you're going to need that data to inform you to make decisions. And every single GSA board across the state is facing the exact same challenge. And nobody from DWR is going to say, well, go ahead and decide this. That's going to be your job. And it's a hard one. Okay. So why are PMAs needed in the basin? Well, first and foremost, to comply with SMGWA. And I'm going to get into more depth on that in a second. I'm going to go through a bunch of what the SMGWA requirements are. The next is to reach your measurable objectives, should you be able to do so. So again, the measurable objectives are the aspirational line, the higher line. Okay, I don't think I know of any basin in the state that is required at this point to comply with SMGWA that unto itself has self-correcting conditions, i.e. won't have to do a PMA. There probably is somewhere out there, I just don't know of one. But the point being is that any place in the state where there's a groundwater basin that is required to comply with SMGWA, they will have one or more PMAs because you've got to implement something or do something to get yourself to a point of sustainability. So, and then above and beyond that to reach measurable objectives. So, why? Comply with SMGWA. Second, to reach measurable objectives for the indicators that have undesirable results. And then lastly, like I just said, the flip side to that, to avoid going below the minimum thresholds. Because then you get the big ding from the state. And again, as we've said many times even tonight, continue to bear in mind, you're always going to do annual and every 5-year reporting. So you're always going to have this opportunity for course correction. And DWR knows that, and they have built, SMGWA is by definition an adaptive management program. It's built into the system. That's why there's 5-year reporting. Okay, so SMGWA compliance. This is a fairly lengthy list, but this is more or less verbatim right out of the regulations, the GSP regulations. So a GSP is you're going to be required to have a description of, oops, I think I skipped over one. Okay, you're going to be required to describe PMAs in your GSP. Okay, it's going to, like I just said, the PMAs are going to be selected by the GSA, by you all, with the best available judgment and the best available data. And then your GSP itself, the document itself, is going to have to include the following. The criteria of when you're going to institute or stop a PMA, so when would you start it and stop it. The process that you've taken to inform the public that a PMA is being considered and or is being implemented. And I'm going to get back to that in a minute, because there's a key distinction there that I want everybody to understand. The permitting and regulatory process required for each PMA. So I'm going to pause for a minute right here on this one and the prior bullet, because this is a really key distinction that will be different for you all and the members of the public than you may be familiar with. Everybody in this room is familiar with CEQA and NEPA, or I presume many of you are. And those of you that are, you know that under CEQA and NEPA, which is the California Environmental Quality Act and the National Environmental Policy Act, those are public disclosure laws, and they require a very public process of identifying what alternatives are, assessing alternatives, disclosing what the impacts of alternatives are in public, and all those kinds of things. That's required under those laws. There's no such requirement under SMGWA. So to a potentially proactive question that somebody from the public might say, which is, okay, well, how are you going to evaluate? And there's a slide later in here about selection. This board, no board, is required to go through a CEQA process of evaluating in that same kind of way these PMAs. They will, you will have to, you're going to have to assess and use the modeling tool and stuff, okay? But it's not done in a CEQA process. Now, that said, let's say this board decides a project that we'll get to in a minute. We'll show you some potential projects. If you choose a project and you say, we really think that's going to work for us, so we're going to want to do it. When you get to the point where you're going to start doing the planning, the actual planning and implementation, not just an overarching selection, we think we'll use that, and here's how and why, but when you actually start getting into sort of implementation planning, that will trigger CEQA. It's the doing of that project, and so you'll have a whole new round of evaluation at that time. But I just want to be clear, SMGWA does not require the same type of evaluations that CEQA and NEPA do. Okay? All right. So you're going to have to report the status of the PMAs in terms of the timetable, start and stop. You're going to have to identify and describe the benefits that are expected to be realized and how those benefits will be evaluated. They'll have to have an explanation how the project or management action will be accomplished. And again, this is all verbatim, and yet it continues. Get more. If you're going to have a project, which I don't think we're going to have here, but if you were to have a project where the source of reliability of water was coming from outside the basin, and that is existing in some parts of the state where they're bringing water in, you're going to have to define and show how you're going to rely on that water, and is that basically a sure thing, not just a crapshoot. You're going to have to define the legal authority that's required. I.e., if you're going to build something, you can't just say we're going to build it, and landowner X comes along and goes, whoa, 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 hold on a second, you never talked to me about that. You're going to have to define the potentially estimated cost for a PMA, and that you have the resources to do it. Okay, and how the management of groundwater extractions and recharge to ensure that chronic lowering and depletion of supply during a drought is offset by increases in other periods. And what all of this is basically meaning, to just sum up for this part, is that if you didn't already gather from this lengthy list of bullets over 3 slides, you have a very high bar of description and information that you will be expected to provide to DWR. Not just a, we picked this, are we good? Great, awesome, let's go. You have a lot of rationale and description that you're going to have to build in. And what DWR is going to be looking for all along the way is, because frankly we're already seeing this in some places early on, as many of you know, in just a few days is the deadline for the first round of GSPs to be turned in for critically overdrafted basins. It's a very informative period when those GSPs start being reviewed. And what we're already seeing in advance, to be honest, of some GSPs is that some GSPs are being put out there and sent to DWR with a little bit of a wing and a prayer. Like, well, we think it's going to work out, and we think this is a situation, and we think that this will all be good, and I'm reasonably confident that DWR is going to reject those. Because you can't just say, well, we think we'll have the money for it, because DWR's connect the dots will be, if you can't say you have the money for it, then you can't do the PMA necessarily. And if you can't do the PMA, then you can't achieve sustainability. So what are you guys doing? Okay, so why discuss PMAs now? Because PMAs are going to be where the rubber hits the road for you all in many ways about what you're going to actually physically do. And that means where a project or management action is going to be implemented in this basin, what kind of partnering might have to be taking effect, where, in addition to the geographic location of where a project might be, but also where the benefit's going to be accrued. In some places in the state where there's really super large basins, you have a project, and you've got other parts of the entire, still within the basin, who are saying, we're not getting any benefit out of that, we're not seeing it, but you guys are. So getting into that kind of discussion amongst you as a board representing all the square inches of this basin are going to be important. Getting into discussion early because, Lois, you are a continual watchdog on costs. So there it is, costs. You need to start understanding what's this going to mean financially for this agency, and by extension, these beneficial users. And who the funders, again, our beneficiaries are. So, why else? Well, if you wait on this stuff until later in the game, you're going to run out of time. Okay, this is one of the things Georgina and I talked about, why the advice was given to this board of let's start front-loading this discussion even tonight, because you got to start ramping up and getting your mindset into starting to discuss this stuff. Fully speculative. No decisions are being made, God knows, tonight or anything, but you got to start getting the conversation going. And then, again, and these are going to be complex discussions, and it's prudent to just get going on it now. So this is where I'm going to start transitioning to my colleagues and your colleagues. So, preliminary problem statements. Again, the model's not done yet. We can't fully yet articulate from a sort of a defensible, hard and fast technical data way all the problems. But we also, in this basin, have a lot of work that you've already done, and we know in many places where the inkling is, where we're pretty sure some things are. So problems facing the basin will determine what PMAs are needed. Again, PMA is a solution. You got to define what the problem is and then look for a solution. Preliminary considerations could include, but aren't limited to, there's a wiggles language, okay, because we don't know all of it, some of these things here. So I'm going to look to some of the colleagues if anyone wants to weigh in further. So we know generally that there's lowered groundwater levels. We know that as such, lowered groundwater levels, quite literally the levels, can impact beneficial users from meeting their normal demand, whether those are institutional beneficial users or private well users or any other beneficial users. We know that lower groundwater levels can result in reduced groundwater infiltration into surface water and stream flow. We had a whole focused session on that a couple months ago. We know that in doing so, that can have an impact on what we call the groundwater dependent ecosystems, as that impact of groundwater to to surface water and those associated groundwater dependent ecosystems gets impacted. We have a reason to believe that there might be issues from nitrates in septic systems, which might therefore also have an impact on flora and fauna through water quality issues. I'm going to look to colleagues, other potential or preliminary problem statements that we don't have up there, but we think might be in the realm of possibilities. Anything else that other folks want to add?
There is some groundwater contamination in different places in the basin of different chemicals.
Yep. Brett, John, Rosemary, anything? No? All right. Okay. So we start, with these problem statements. Eventually, and this is where we want to start, again, we've done certain versions of these lists going back as far as a year ago in the winter workshops. Now we're returning to them, and this is again where I want to look to my colleagues to be a little more expansive on what some of these terms mean. So I'm going to sort of go through them, and then we'll go back to this first slide. So, potential, management action, continue to enhance use of water efficiency programs. You've done an outstanding job, as have many places in the state over the last several years coming through the last drought and seeing very, very significant changes in per capita water use around the state of California and here by example. And continuation of those, and then it's that question of did we max out? Have we done, we sort of squeezed every last drop from an efficiency perspective of it, or are there more gains to be had? And those are tough and important questions. Redistribution of pumping, okay, which can be either a management action by using existing pumping conditions or a project if new wells. And sometimes that gets into the fact of whether here or elsewhere of you may choose ultimately that there's a better logic to put well fields in a different location because you can manifold them together and you can serve beneficial users more effectively than where they are right now. Rosemary?
I just want to give an example of this from the Mid-County Basin. So the issue in the Mid-County, of course, is seawater intrusion, and so both SoCal and the city have moved some of their pumping, their municipal pumping inland far enough that it's mitigating some of those impacts. It make them go away completely, but it's a way of moving the pumping to a part of the basin that's less likely to draw the seawater into the coast, and then giving us some time to figure out how to create better long-term solutions for that. So that's an example.
Okay. Any other on that particular topic from folks? John?
Well, another example that we might want to consider also is vertical redistribution. In other words, if the Santa Margarita layer, the Santa Margarita aquifer is what's mostly feeding our streams, maybe it's better to be pumping from the deeper aquifers and reducing the impact on those surface streams or those groundwater dependent ecosystems.
And that is an example, again, of both extensive creativity that you'll be able to employ as decision makers and may need to employ. All right, so conjunctive use of surface water in lieu of groundwater pumping. So that's certainly something that's going to be done elsewhere in the state and could be done here. It comes with its own challenges of infrastructure and associated costs, let alone permitting. You don't just go pop a straw into a surface water and start taking it. There's very significant requirements therein if you don't already have the rights or the infrastructure. Groundwater recharge, so ASRs we call it, aquifer storage and recovery. So basically taking surface water and using it in some way or another to apply it, inject it, spread it, whatever the geology will accommodate. Any thoughts or comments?
I'll go with number 3. This is something that we are considering conceptually with San Lorenzo because we don't have surface water, so we would have to partner with somebody. It is one of the cheapest, the least costly projects because it is just leaving groundwater in the basin and using surface water in lieu of that. We haven't moved past conceptual with that. They're based on what Santa Cruz and Soquel Creek have done. There needs to be not just an idea and let's do it, but like you already referred to, there needs to be environmental side of that, financial side of it. It's not just taking water, it's actually buying water, if you will. And then there is a water quality that can our pipes handle if we put different blend of water in them, what happens to the corrosion in the pipes.
And both San Luis Valley and Scotts Valley have been working on infrastructure projects to improve that transfer of water back and forth with grant funding and additional funding.
Yeah, so you've got the intertie, and that's an expanded facility and a first start. And as a reminder, and I know I sound like a broken record on this particular one, but guiding principle number 14, I happen to remember that one of yours, is a commitment to an integrated water system, and the idea that nobody gets a free lunch and nobody's taking water from somebody else, but the intent is a rising tide lifts all boats. Get a system that's keeping everybody whole, because there will be times where you're in the high clover with groundwater, and there will be times where you're in the high clover with surface water and the groundwater not, and the ability to move it around and keep everybody whole is really important. Rosemary?
I was just going to add on number 3 the seasonality of this one. So oftentimes when you have more surface water available in the winter, you can provide it to somebody who's typically a all-season groundwater pumper, and then they can turn their wells off. And then maybe if you have surface water issues in the summer, it can go the other way. So, you know, there's a whole set of strategies for really leveraging and maximizing the resources by using this creative surface water, groundwater management strategy.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Number
Bruce.
1, is anything expected of us? I mean, we really did a good job in this county, as you mentioned. People tore up their lawns and they're using less water, and we did a really good job. Are we expected to match that again in the next crisis type of a thing? Or is there any?
Well, I mean, yes and no, I'll say, and what I mean that for is that, you know, there is a relatively new, it was passed, I guess, 1 legislative or 2 legislative cycles ago, but it's water conservation, the water conservation way of life kind of legislation, SB 1668 and 17 something, and you know, it is the continuation of a series of water use efficiency legislation and regulations that began back in 2007 and have continued on and have been implemented. DWR has got a very extensive water use efficiency, or WUE, program that they're doing right now. There are requirements that are being held of water purveyors throughout the state that they're going to have to continue to show increased long-range planning on things like supply and assessment of what your shortage contingencies are and things like that. I know Rosemary and others have been living very deeply about that. I know that because your name came up in a meeting I was in yesterday. And you are well known, and the city of Santa Cruz is actually very, very well known, literally as one of the leaders in the state of doing some of this. So, notwithstanding that not all of you are the city of Santa Cruz, by extension, I'm just going to tell you that the city of Santa Cruz is up there with a list of only like 3 or 4 or 5 organizations in the state that are really considered fantastic at having done some long-range planning and continuing to do so. So there's going to be, you know, continued requirements. Basically, what the state is looking for is better documentation and better long-range planning by water purveyors, so that when the next drought comes, you do not have a whole ton of water purveyors going, help, we don't know what to do, we don't have the resources, and we didn't do any contingency planning for what to do at this time.
So I just want to add that the SIGMA isn't necessarily the mechanism for implementing and sort of showing regulatory compliance with making water conservation a way of life, the new sort of strategy from state. It's the urban water management plans. And so Santa Cruz does one of those every 5 years. Scotts Valley does one, and also San Lorenzo Valley does one. So these are the mechanisms that bring that into play. And at least in Mid-County, we showed as projects and management actions the ongoing baseline efforts that we're doing as a kind of a given. These are things that are ongoing.
Okay, continuing on potential. Oh, I'm sorry, John, go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, I was going to say a little bit more about the conjunctive use. Just a reminder that San Luis Valley Water District is already doing conjunctive use, sort of balancing their surface water sources and their groundwater sources. And they don't turn on their wells until they need to, until their surface water sources are not producing enough, and then they need to turn on the wells. So the wetter years, they use a lot less groundwater and leave that groundwater in the ground for a longer period of time before they need to turn on their wells. You know, we've got a grant right now to look at ways that we can maybe increase that use of conjunctive use and actually be able to put more water back in the streams through doing that. And then the other thing on number 4 with the aquifer storage and recovery is somewhat related to number 3 with the conjunctive use. The in lieu use, you can only get so much out of that during the wintertime. The water demands are relatively low, so even though you may have a lot of excess water in the wintertime, you can only use so much of that. But if you have a way to store it, someplace to store it by putting it into the aquifer, then you can make more use of that excess winter water and store it for either a drought or for summertime when demands are significantly higher. So that a lot of these are sort of interrelated on how you implement them.
And again, that's a lot, injecting that water would be a lot cheaper than trying to make water to inject.
Right.
And you know, to a question that had been asked during the modeling session, this is exactly why the model exists, because you're going to then need to run those scenarios that you think adequately assess or adequately can represent risk factors and what your PMAs might be to deal with this, and then that's going to translate in, as we've already said, into you as a board making decisions, very critical decisions about investments, like literally financial investments of, you know, what are we going to do if we face a worst case scenario? We can be reasonably certain that the last drought that we saw, while the worst drought on record, is not the worst drought that you're going to face, let alone ongoing climate change issues. Okay. Additional potential PMAs. So groundwater recharge with recycled water and indirect potable reuse. Anybody want to weigh in?
Yeah, so we have done a feasibility study on that a couple of years ago here, and we are doing another phase of that because some parameters have changed since we did it. So we need to look at some other alternatives where the recycled water would come from. Original one was to use City of Scotts Valley's wastewater treatment facility and excess recycled water they can produce there. They are the only recycled water tertiary treatment provider at the moment in North County, but they have some challenges there, and we need, in order for this project to make any sense dollar-wise for us, we need to have a reliable source. It's an old plant, so we are kind of expanding. Well, if this doesn't work, what other options we have? So we are starting. So with some of those projects, we are doing it already. We're not waiting for. We did not wait for SGMA to become a law. We are not waiting for the model to be done, because we do believe it's a resource we have here, a recycled water, and we need to take the excess of that and put it to good use, beneficial use. So this is a long-term plan and project.
You want to continue on number 6 while we're at it, while we're doing on the theme of recycled water?
I think it's good.
Or okay, all right.
Yeah.
Rosemary?
Well, it's doable technically to also augment surface water with recycled water. We don't have surface water, so that's not a project for us. But it's a suite of projects, what can be done with recycled water.
Yeah, so why don't you and maybe give an example and describe what we're really talking about here.
So in the,
Can everybody hear Rosemary? Right. You're Demure Flower, yeah.
As Brett noted, this is technically feasible. We actually did phase 1 of a recycled water study looking at our needs for surface water, additional surface water to meet drought. And so this was one thing that's identified. The idea would have been to treat wastewater from the Santa Cruz Regional Wastewater Facility and then pump it back up to Loch Lomond, introduce it into Loch Lomond. That creates an environmental buffer. It stays in Loch Lomond and then comes back into the system and through the drinking water treatment plant on Grand Mill Road, and then back into the system. What's going on in Scotts Valley, we're just about to get underway with the phase 2 of this study to look at both the 5 and 6 as they might relate to us using surface water or recycled water for supply augmentation for Santa Cruz's needs in the event that surface water isn't going to meet our needs in the long run. But basically, you've got to have a reservoir like a Loch Lomond that's big enough that you can introduce some water and that blends and stays, and then you have a way to bring it back into the system through your typical infrastructure.
A question.
Advanced treatment water?
Yes, it would be the same as what Pure Water SoCal is exact, and either of these two would be that. And they're both called indirect potable reuse because there's an environmental buffer that's created between when you put it into the ground or the surface water supply and when you take it back into for use.
Yeah, go ahead, Rick.
You know, as we go down these, I wouldn't want people to think that just one of these potential PMAs are going to solve all of our problems. You know, San Lorenzo Valley has thought for a long time that the use of our surface water and conjunctive use has always been very appealing because of the rainfall pattern we have on surface water. But with climate change and the change of intensities, we see stream flow go way up during a rainfall event, and we see it come right back down. Right. You can look at the USGS gauge at Big Trees in Felton and see the San Lorenzo River shoot up and go right back down. If we don't get a longer rainfall pattern where we get, like the old days, it rains several days in a row and get the stream flows and get the groundwater flowing, without storage, we're going to have some real issues. And San Lorenzo Valley doesn't have storage. And storage can come in a reservoir, it can come in an aquifer, it can come in many ways. But just not one of these potential PMAs is not going to solve our problem. It's going to be several coming together, and they may be unique to make it work. It's just there's too many. There's too many variables that we're not sure of yet.
And that's actually a really excellent segue to the question I was going to ask, and I recognize this may be a little bit of a risky question, but to Perrette and Rosemary in particular, given that you spoke of kind of early, like bench scale kind of studies, not significantly more than that, is it reasonable to say that were those to be expanded, were you to start identifying feasibility, that part of that would then, you would then be looking for partners. I mean, you would be looking for partnerships within this basin or maybe even elsewhere to become contributing members, again, with the context that contributing members are also beneficiaries. And that's getting to the point that, I think maybe indirectly Rick was just getting, I was just going to require multiple projects, but you're going to be looking for various forms of beneficiaries and partnerships to make all this work. So is it reasonable, or is that too early for you all to tell that you'd be looking for partners?
I think for me, or at least from Scott's Valley Water District Board, and what I heard also from this board, the cost comes almost at the end of each sentence. We need to consider solutions that we can reasonably pay for, and not we as agency, because the agency does not have any money. We have to go either work through our member agencies, but the member agencies don't have all kinds of money sitting around either, so they have to go to their ratepayers. And it has to make sense for our ultimate end user that we are using their money the best possible way. And we all know economies of scale. So there is a sweet spot. If you're trying to do a project that is only giving you 500 acre-feet per year versus 5,000 acre-feet per year, it's not, the cost of the project is not 10 times higher. So per unit cost, if we're talking about how can we really make it to make sense from all standpoints, that if we can put our heads together and our money together, it's going to come cheaper for all of us. So it has to be part of that. I don't really see another way of making it cost effective without
it. I've just been reviewing the governor's recently released 2020 Water Resiliency Plan, and I guess what I would say is that some of the direction in there about regional solutions and partnerships for improving reliability and resiliency against the whole range of potential future implications, whether they're climate change or the, storm events, or ability to make better use of the resources that you already have and that you have control over. These things resonate with me and with my organization in terms of the kind of engagement that we think is probably in all of our future. And as utilities, we've done some work just to look at what happens if we work together in some effective way to how does everyone benefit. So I think that I totally agree with Corette. There's a lot of opportunity. There are definitely challenges, but I think there's plenty of opportunities, and I think that this forum creates a great place for us to talk about how to take advantage of the opportunities and build on those and address the challenges as we go forward.
Before we finish this list, I'll just put one little plug both for the board to remember and members of the public, really frankly, remembers that, again, a year ago when we were doing one of the workshops, several of you were there. You will recall that at the workshop where we wove in specifically the topic of project management actions, we created, I alluded to this earlier, we created a tabletop exercise where we introduced different options and we talked about pros and cons, and I'm not going to get into details. When we did the report backs from the tables, and remember we had like 10 different, 10 or so tables, the single largest overarching commonality that emerged from all those tables, which were tables of people who represented people, citizens of San Lorenzo and Scotts Valley and the county and the city, when they were sitting together at tables and working through things, the single most commonality was, we're going to have to integrate. We're going to have to work together, we're going to have to partner, we're going to have to integrate. That was, and I'm not just making this up because I'm the one that transcribed all the data in my staff. Again, it was the single biggest commonality, we're going to have to work together and integrate. That's what emerged from that. Okay, continuing on. Groundwater recharge with stormwater, i.e. low impact development, so the capturing of runoff and stormwater. Anybody wish to speak to that?
Yeah, we have 3 systems in Scotts Valley. We've had them now for a number of years. They work great. If it's a wet year. They have no benefit to us in a dry or average, even some average year. And what Rick was just talking about, how the river behaves with the more recent patterns of rainfall. It's a spike, and those all of those catchment basins that we have put in, they overflow. It's too much, and we can't design, to the 100-year storm. We have to have some reasonable design that maybe covers an average year, but we don't get average years anymore. So it's a downside of this, but it certainly is a tool, and we have 3 of them. We were able to do one of them with 100% grant funding from the state, so it made perfect sense there. If we had to do it with our ratepayers' money, it's a very, very expensive source of supply. It comes about 10-15 times more expensive than the first one. That is also expensive. The indirect potable reuse, taking recycled water, advanced treating it, injecting it into the ground, all of it together, including the power that goes into treating it. It's an energy intensive process, and then injecting it into the ground, that is also energy intensive. The LID is about 10-15 times more expensive source water than the IPR. So it's not on a large scale, but certainly should be in our toolbox to add to the portfolio.
Well, and it's happening right now in Scotts Valley and everywhere in the county, I believe, maybe even in the state. Certainly the county, and certainly in our region of the Regional Water Quality Board, because anyone that builds anything has to do that, and it's free. Not to them, and not to people buying the houses, but it's free to the community in general. And most of the time, or a lot of the times, that method of capturing the water mitigates some of the variability in rainfall in terms of when you get either the quick storms or the constant light storms, which we, I get it, and average is no such thing as average in this area, it's whatever happens. But you capture more, whereas you lower the transvaporation loss because you're collecting the water from new impervious surface and putting it actually into the ground and cutting the transvaporation stage out. So if you take a field of heavy grass with a bunch of acacia trees and replace that with a large underground collection off of the street, you're going to get a lot more water in a small storm back into the ground than you would with it hitting the field and getting sucked up by the grass and by the acacia trees. So it's kind of an interesting, especially if the area what you're putting it in the ground is highly rechargeable, and there's a lot of areas like that in Scotts Valley.
We go to Doug and then John.
Yeah, question for Red. I mean, it is kind of counterintuitive that the MAR would be that much less cost effective than the IPR. Can you elaborate a little bit on why you think that's the case?
Well, you were saying LID, right?
LID.
Oh,
LID.
Okay, fine, sorry. LID.
Yeah, no, the LID is because of you have to actually clean it. You cannot collect water from the pavement, parking lots, and put it into the ground untreated. So there has to be treatment in there, in the ground. There has to be, it's a lot of excavating and then compacting it back and putting the system there. And the quantity of water that we're able to do, we can't go too deep and we can't go too large. So it's just, it's that one we have, the most recent one is at the Transit Center, and that project was a little over $1 million. And
also, just when a public agency does it, just double the cost.
Yeah. And that's true, because every public works project has to be prevailing wage, and it is, 30 to 50% more expensive.
And there's O&M, I presume, because
Yeah,
you've got these
O&M too.
facilities that
Yeah.
are just on the streets and they're, Okay, John.
I was just going to expand a little bit on that. I mean, the LID could almost be considered a management action also, because as Chris said, it's policy now, it's actually a requirement of the stormwater program that any new development or redevelopment maintain runoff rates at pre-development levels and infiltration rates at pre-development levels. So as properties either redeveloped or if there's new development, it does have to be done. So, and it's done outside of the agency, that's the property owner that's responsible for that. And that's a way that also gets at that issue of, we talked earlier about the model assumes no change in land use. One can say, well, how can you predict the future if you're not going to predict more impervious surface? Well, we may have more impervious surface, but it's going to have to be mitigated by the use of LID to maintain those infiltration rates. So even though there will probably most likely be more development, it's going to be mitigated development that maintains the infiltration capabilities.
All right, then continue this last one. So groundwater augmentation with stormwater via percolation ponds, what we call managed aquifer recharge. So anybody want to speak to Mark or Flood Mark? John?
That was one that we also looked at when we were doing a conjunctive use study, collecting the difference between LID and managed aquifer recharge. LID is really sort of limited to the project area. It's collecting the water from a project, whereas managed aquifer recharge, you tend to collect the water from a larger area and transport it someplace where it can then be infiltrated. We evaluated the potential to collect stormwater from a large portion of sort of the Camp Beavers area and then take it over to the Hanson Quarry and infiltrate it there. And again, as Corette said, it was very expensive. We thought, well, shoot, that ought to be a cheap and easy project, but it was not. With the the pipeline construction and moving the water through the mountain and that sort of thing, getting it to a place where you could actually put the water to the ground was going to be relatively expensive. There may be other places where it makes more sense, but that particular project really didn't pan out in terms of dollars.
Okay. All right, so that is a pretty good representative example. Again, potential, not exclusive, not the only. But the point here before we go on is to start, for some of you, reminding you, for some of you really introducing you for the first time, an early stage of the kinds of conversations you as a board are going to need to be having in the coming months as you start taking things that are conceptual or even early stage, reconnaissance level or bench scale planning, and sometime in the next 2 years, making some legitimate hard decisions about what you're going to do to ensure you're achieving and maintaining sustainability. So some questions, and these are just our first cut on speculation. So some of this is a little redundant now to some things we've talked about, but so how are PMAs selected? Well, like I said at the outset, SGWA doesn't mandate a specific evaluation process, okay? Like a CEQA or NEPA, okay? The GSA is going to have to assess and select the PMAs that, we've already said that, address the underground results, aid in achieving measurable objectives, and like we also said, at the bare minimum, can assist in staying above the minimum thresholds. This is all going to be data and dialogue amongst you all. Right? You're going to have to describe the PMA in your GSP. So in addition to making the selection, you're going to have to justify and basically do the homework, if you will. Could PMAs lead to water quality impairments? Okay, well, we don't know. The point here being is basically all the things we were just talking about here about take water from one place, move into another, move water around. There's all kinds of things, whether it's surface water quality that the state board, and recycled water quality that the state board watches very, very closely and prohibits, frankly. You can't just take recycled water and put it in because it doesn't necessarily deal with contaminants of emerging concern. We call CDCs, or it doesn't deal or allow for if you're taking water and injecting it into an aquifer, and the concern at the state board level is you might actually be introducing something that is then actually from a water quality perspective damaging to water in the aquifer. So it isn't just a simple, hey, we got it, let's put it someplace in the ground. Likewise, if you're doing things and you're introducing and you start basically changing the subterranean flow patterns, we know that there are plumes in certain places. There may very well be other plumes that haven't been discovered. And as we've talked about under the water quality indicator, under one of the 6 sustainable indicators, water quality there is you have to be cautious of, did you do something that exacerbated or mobilized something that otherwise wouldn't have been mobilized? So, water quality impacts will be evaluated through the model. That's yet another thing the modeling tool can be used for. PMAs are not allowed to negatively impact, so you can't create redirected effects. Okay, you can't say, well, but we're increasing our groundwater levels. Well, we get this water quality issue. That's not going to be allowed. You have to be solving for both. GSAs will need to monitor water quality to ensure that they don't mobilize or they don't exacerbate. And Lois, back to you as as one of many, but certainly a known steward of the dollar signs. Monitoring, you could just put dollar signs behind monitoring. Okay, monitoring costs money. It's not sexy. It's a darn hard thing to get grant money for, if at all. But it's essential. Otherwise, you don't have answers. Okay. Where will they be located? Okay, well, it's going to be important to ensure that you're going to get the maximum benefits, but this gets to the question of, where is it going to be located? Whose land is going to be on? How are you going to partner? What part of your basin is it going to be in? Is that part of that basin, is it going to then benefit only that part of that basin, or are you building in a more conjunctive and integrated use that everybody's getting a part of it? And if you're going to have beneficiaries that are not directly adjacent to where our project is, are those beneficiaries going to pay somehow? That's another whole set of questions that you all are going to grapple with as a board. And the model is going to be used, like we talked about several times here. That's among many things, is going to be used to assess under certain scenarios that you're going to load in and build, which won't be cheap, and Cameron's talked about that too. You can't just like willy-nilly just build like 100 different scenarios. You have to figure out what scenarios you want to try to run, because that's plugging in new data and running new runs in the model, but that's what you're going to do with this model, amongst many things. How long is it going to take to plan and implement? A long time, many years. Okay, you got land. In some cases, for projects, you got land acquisition or member acquisition. You've got all the necessary statutory and regulatory compliance, whether it is CEQA and NEPA or Federal Endangered Species Act issues, depending on land or water use, or stream bed alteration agreements. If you're building a facility in a stream, you don't just do that, you've got to do stream bed alteration agreements. You've got to be dealing with Section 401 at the very bare minimum of the Clean Water Act, if you're going to be doing anything that might be modifying, even temporarily, the water quality of a tributary to implement a project. All of these is the big long cycle of permitting that must be done. It isn't just, hey, let's do it, boom. I get a funny story. Over in the Central Valley, there's this thing called flood managed aquifer recharge, and I've been in all these different meetings, and it's funny and a little unfortunate. Is, you know, so these are all ag guys, right? And ag guys are doers, you know, and they're like, I can do that. You know, like the water's there. I can just, you know, before the season starts, I can just get my D5 out there into this creek, and I can just, you know, build a berm, and we'll just pump the water out. And I think, whoop, 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 whoop. Not so bad. But in their mind, it's like, let's just bring a bulldozer to the creek bed and put a pipe in there, and we're good, right? That's all that, you know. Funding, obviously, and then last but certainly not least, beneficial user and stakeholder support. What are your constituents going to go along with and support? How long is it going to take to see the benefits? You know, like you said, you're going to do monitoring. You're going to have the annual and 5-year reporting. You're talking on geologic scale, literally and figuratively here. So you all know that some of your aquifers are very responsive and some not, depending on how close they are to surface and where there's aquatards and things like that. But, you know, and again, you're going to have to monitor those benefits because, as I said at the outset, it's those benefits and the documentation of those benefits is what you're going to use and report to the state to show that you're achieving and maintaining sustainability. So you must monitor for benefits. Woo. Okay. There we go. Okay. So, board. Additional questions and discussion? Ruth and then Dale.
Do we currently have nitrate problems with septic tanks?
The word in there is may have problems. I asked Dave to insert that word.
Which I did.
Which you did. That we do have a nitrate TMDL for the San Lorenzo River watershed. In other words, the state has determined that nitrate levels in the San Lorenzo River are too high and should be reduced. We may have to revisit that issue. But right now we are under a mandate to actually reduce nitrate levels in the river, and in order to reduce nitrate levels in the river, we also have to reduce nitrate levels in the groundwater that's contributing to river, essentially the summertime nitrate levels which are coming from base flow. Most of that nitrate in the groundwater and in the river is coming from septic systems and sandy soils. We did a lot of monitoring back in the 90s. We did water quality modeling, budgeting, and that sort of thing. Septic systems and sandy soils are the biggest single source of nitrate. There's other things, some of the stables, some of the fertilizer application, the old wastewater disposal of Scotts Valley sewer into the quarries. All those have contributed to the elevated nitrate levels, but the biggest ongoing source is the septic systems and the sandy soils. Much less so the septic systems and other types of soils that are much better at treating and removing nitrate. So there is an issue.
John, are we seeing in this basin, and I guess perhaps particularly on the lower reaches of the San Lorenzo, or maybe you guys are, you know, sort of bioaccumulative effects of nutrient loading, you know, reduced DO and things like that would be impacting?
We do. I mean, we see that not so much.
DO is dissolved oxygen, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So what happens if you get overabundance of nutrient, you start getting algal breakouts or things like that. They start taking in the oxygen, and in doing so, that starts impacting the other aquatic species.
In the main parts of the river, we don't see depressed dissolved oxygen, but we do see that down in the lagoon, where we have stratification and we have quite a bit of nutrient enrichment, both nitrate and phosphate, and certainly the biological growth contributes to that depression of dissolved oxygen. The other big issue when we developed this nitrate total maximum daily load essentially was the impacts on the city of Santa Cruz drinking water supply. Taste and odor, and also dissolved organic compounds. As you get not growth of just algae, but other organisms, actinomycetes, that release these very strong taste and odor compounds. The city was having a lot of trouble treating the water to keep it from tasting grassy and having other issues. So one of the main emphasis is to reduce the nitrate levels, is really to help to improve the quality of the drinking water that was coming out of the river. And that's I think that's an ongoing challenge. The city's gotten very good at treating the water, but it's an ongoing challenge in terms of treating the water.
And it is a nitrate TMDL, or is it an overall nutrient TMDL?
It's a nitrate TMDL, yeah.
Just another comment to make related to pharmaceuticals, personal care products. We see evidence of those in the river, particularly in not so much the really, really intense flooding situations, because they're kind of washed out, if you will. They're overwhelmed by the volumes. But in more moderate events, particularly after the soil has become saturated, we see the mobilization of septic effluent, and that comes into the river and brings with it the sort of artificial sweeteners, the sort of ibuprofens, those kinds of typical things. There's a document from 2016 testing on our website that you can find that describes what we saw. We did a whole bunch of testing over a whole year under first flush conditions and wet conditions, drier conditions. We see some stuff kind of consistently in small quantities, but the wetter conditions where the groundwater is more mobilized and contributing to base flow, we will see that at the big trees and at the Tate diversion.
Dale?
First, thank you for that presentation. It was very informative and a lot of good stuff in there. As you were going through the potential PMAs and going down that list, there was, agencies saying, well, we're doing this, we're doing that, these things are already happening. Is that getting incorporated into the model? Are we taking into consideration things that are going on right now that are potentially beneficial to the aquifers and the sustainability? So how do we capture that? And then if these things are going on right now individually, how, when we as a board are looking at these projects and say, okay, we think these projects or this project is going to have the most beneficial, or it's going to be the most beneficial to everybody, what if it conflicts with things that are already going on? How do those get resolved?
Great question. I'll look to Brett and Rosemary maybe first as leaders of organizations.
With respect to what's sort of going on, the planning level work that's going on, I think that the key thing, and that sort of was, we modeled this in the Mid-County Basin, right? We have a clear problem statement for what our needs are. We have resources we're using from the Mid-County Basin in terms of the Belts Wellfield groundwater source. So, we're part of the problem there, and we worked collaboratively across all the jurisdictions to figure out how to be part of the solution as well. So we didn't end up in a conflict where what somebody else wanted to do was in conflict with what we wanted to do. And the work has been going on long enough that, between the various agencies, that I think there was a lot of alignment, if you will, about the sort of directions that need to be moved in. It doesn't mean that as we're implementing, we won't find that there are some challenges of, you took up all the space in the aquifer and now there's no space for us to put anything in the aquifer kind of thing. And I think up here, I think it's the same kind of thing. I don't believe, and Fred, you can correct me or Rick, if you see things differently, I don't think that anybody has already made up their mind about what they're doing. We're all trying to explore what works to address our issues and the basin's issues, but to do that in a way that, uses this mechanism as a way to help define the problems and then really look at how various kinds of solutions that people have been evaluating will start to come in to address them.
But to also to point out, I'll go to Brad and maybe Rick as well, but to the additional part of Dale's question about, to the extent that things, actions, be they what they may, are being implemented already, are they accounted for in a
I
model?
think the only ones that now have some true significant maybe impact are the relatively large LID systems, and that is something that we have been tracking and reporting to include in our annual reports. So I believe that's something that we do need to make sure that it's there, or if it's not, it's included. Everything else is, Rosemary is absolutely correct. We are still in the feasibility or kind of preliminary planning phase. And if nothing else, I think it helps this agency, because as you saw from Dave's presentation, you can't just come up with a project without some very valid background and cost analysis and how it's going to help. So this work hopefully can feed into, and we don't have to recreate the wheel and spend money again because it's already done.
I mean, that's kind of the answer I was looking for was, and don't get me wrong, I think these are great and I think it will help us, but I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page, you know, and as this agency, because you guys all, we all represent different agencies, but we're supposed to be looking at this as a whole, as a single agency, and going after the projects that give us the most bang for the buck. So, but I hear all these little things going on. I just want to make sure we're all still moving in the right direction. And I think we are. I mean, I do, but I just want to put it out there.
And I can. Did you have some? Okay. I mean, I can tell you, and you know, some of y'all know this. Either me directly or by extension my staff at CCP, we're currently working in at least 10 different basins in the state on GSP development now. We were under governance working out to 35 some different basins. I can categorically tell you, for what it's worth, both for your board and members of the public, there is no other basin that I work in or my staff works in that has a more coordinated, integrated set of water resource leaders consistently working together than this basin. No other single basin with a group of water leaders representing different agencies that work more closely together. I observe it on a regular basis. So you really do have that going for you, whether you believe it or not. I'm telling you, you really, really do. It's really excellent. Other questions? Okay.
You have a question about minimum thresholds. I've asked questions in the past. It seemed like it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't be below that at a point in time.
Correct.
So I just wanted to elaborate or get a little bit more explanation. Could the minimum threshold basically be an average over time, or could it be once every 3 years, or could it be?
In a manner of speaking, yes. I mean, you know, there's a term that we use in Sigma, and I'll look to you all to also weigh in, but there's a term that we use called the glide path. And what the glide path really means, and another term that I didn't remind you all of, was interim milestones. Okay, so you're going to, within your GSP, you're going to set your minimum thresholds, you're going to set your measurable objectives, you're going to have that space between, which is the margin of operational flexibility, and then you're going to have these interim milestones, which is your best guess of how you're going to sort of track your progress to sustainability, and that's the glide path. And in some cases in the state, and this is understood at the agency, at DWR level and state board level, in some cases in the state, it's going to have to get worse before it gets better, or it may get worse and it get better, and maybe worse again. Your trajectory is towards sustainability. That's why it's over 20 years, and that's why you're doing annual and 5-year reporting. But yes, to your point, you may dip below. Part of, therefore, the modeling again and the analyses is you try to project that in advance to the state and say, we know for whatever reasons we're going to do this, and then go that way. You don't want to have a circumstance where you go below minimum thresholds and you report that to DWR, and DWR goes, what happened? And you're like, I don't know. Beats me.
We've done some of that in Mid-County. Some of our thresholds are point in time, like never go below it, and some of them are rolling averages. So I think groundwater levels, in some parts of the basin. Their rolling average is over, I think, a 5-year period. So, and also bearing in mind that we have 20 years to get ourselves to the point where we're locked in on those rolling averages.
Yeah, well, I like the idea of rolling averages
Yeah.
because it allows you to still have the glide path, but to have some volatility along the way.
Yeah, the cases where you want to avoid that are a situation like where you've got a seawater intrusion where you can't go below it because you're opening yourself up immediately to a vulnerability, but in a lot of cases there's really no need to do something that severe.
And you know, and I think Sean, I wasn't able to be here last meeting, but Sean in some way or other touched on this, but if, you know, the interesting dilemma about SGMA is that SGMA implementation is going to be happening against the time frame where we collectively believe, or those that are climate scientists collectively believe, that we will begin to see appreciable, measurable, actual climate impact, climate changes. So that whole, like, it's not, sometime in that 20-year window, it's no longer going to be speculative, where it's readily believed. I recognize that. There are some members of the society that don't believe that yet. That's fine, but I'm just saying that's why, you know, because, so you're making these decisions set against the backdrop of, you know, in 20 years we'll know how much climate impact we really have, right? So, other questions from the board? Luke?
You kind of glossed over the PMA selection process. I'd like to go back and ask a question. I understand that we don't have a mandate for a specific evaluation process of PMA alternatives. So what do we do? Do we use some sort of classical system like compare and contrast the different PMAs? Do we do pros and cons? It would seem to me we have to have some sort of system where, you know, you force rank your PMAs, so you're going to pick the ones that rise to the top, so you get the best bang out of your buck. So what do we?
I mean, everything you just said and probably then some, and I'll again look at pardon. And the modeling. I mean, that's. I mean, my point is that whereas under CEQA, NEPA, I don't want to belabor it, but it's under CEQA, NEPA, you've got a project description, and then you've got to come up with alternatives, all of which will answer to that project description. There's a sort of formulaic way in which you do it. Doesn't mean you wouldn't do it the same way as a board and choose to do it something similar. I'm just saying that kind of that public disclosure evaluation under SGMA is not required. That said, yes, it's the modeling tool. It's you all getting to a point within the next year and a half, 2 years, or really year and a half at the most, of saying, all right, we're taking, remember that big vague set of 8 things that Seppo's talked about in January of 2020. Well, now we have to have some really hard discussions about those, and then we have to decide which of these do we think are reasonable, and then you're going to run modeling scenarios and use this modeling tool to then test them out and say, okay, we think this will work. What's the model telling us? And then you're gonna have to make those kind of cost-benefit decisions as a board, because you're more than likely not going to be able to afford every model run that you would want to do. You're going to have to make informed decisions about what to test and not test. And yes, that whole process unto itself, I'm sure the technical consultant team will be advising you, but at the end of the day, you as a board are going to have to reconcile and get to consensus on this one or this one, these many or that many, in terms of assessments. So.
Something to add to that, we do have funding, I think, in our current budget to some extent, and I added a lot more funding in the grant request that I submitted to hire a consultant that will help us be able to take these kind of bigger ideas and make them more apples to apples. So making sure that we're comparing the same time frames, the same amount of water generated, so we're not working in different units or over different time periods, and we take into account the lifespan of the project and the multiple beneficiaries, and we get it to a point where we can kind of look at it all and make a more an easier comparison than having they've looked at this one project over here and they work in millions of acres per year, and this has a 5-year lifespan, and it will start. They budgeted using 2014 dollars. Now it'll be all comparable.
See, I think one other thing to say about that is, to me, one of the first things the model's going to help us really understand is what's the current condition in terms of those problem statements. So how would we really characterize the scale of the problems, and maybe to some degree you know, we don't have any problem over here, but we might have a problem over here. And then, to some degree, those problem statements are gonna help us understand what solutions might be applicable in those, including the scale of the solutions, right? So if you have a small problem, you might need a small solution. If you have a big problem, you might need more than one or a bigger one. So
And that bears out, again, however conceptual this what we're saying right now still is, but this bears out why it was advised to even start tonight with this discussion, because realistically speaking, it's January 2020. You guys are, every agency now is pencils down roughly July, August of 2021. Okay, you're done, because the next 6 months is final compilation, final organizational review, public review, you know, so your GSP is done for all intent and purposes, not January 31st, 2022. It's done 6 months before that or thereabouts. So you can see just by this conversation that I'm not trying to do scare tactic, but the complexity of this one more thing, that's why we have to have you guys starting these kind of conversations now, however conceptual they are, because you can't wait till 3 months before GSP is done to start working on this stuff, right? That should start becoming self-evident now.
And the other thing that's good to think about too, and this list of potential PMAs we put out there are things that we've thought of or that we're working on so far. There may be other things that we haven't thought of yet. So, you know, as you read the literature or you think about this thing, if you guys come up with other ideas for PMAs, or if you have other ideas tonight, you know, let's get them out on the table and think about them, discuss them as a group. So don't necessarily take the list we gave you tonight as a done deal. That's it's a work in progress with all of us.
Ruth?
Responding to John, I really like direct potable reuse. I see lots of problems with it. First off, it's not legal yet. And and the public would need a lot of educating to take it. But on the other hand, in terms of energy use and the cost of energy, you're not dumping water down into the ground and then pumping it back up again, or pumping it up to a reservoir and then taking it out again. Is there a place for direct potable reuse in this, given the time frame and constraints?
It could be one of those that's sort of in the quiver, so to speak, or the backup plans that as we implement, say, our initial PMAs and we get to 5 years and see how we're doing so far. You know, I don't know how quickly the state's going to work on it. Everybody said, well, a lot of people say that yes, the state's going to approve it at some point, but we don't know when that's going to be. There's a few folks that say
also, yeah, it depends on the technology.
Yeah.
This is changing rapidly.
Yeah.
Well, to answer your question, I don't think we can include a project that is not permitted in the state of California yet. But I think it could very well become a phase 2 of an IPR, because the front end is very much the same. It's just what you do with when you have treated the water to the advanced level. Do you need to put it in the groundwater or blend it in the reservoir, or can you inject it directly into the system? So I think it could be what's next for the IPR.
And I wouldn't underestimate what you just said about public education. Very quick anecdote. I had just recently, I have a very close friend of mine who is not a water policy wonk like I am. We were just sitting and chatting, and she said, "So what do you think about this toilet tap stuff?" And I started going, "Well, I think it's a really excellent idea." And she and this is a person I know very closely, love her dearly, and she just like scrunched up her face and like, "It's disgusting." And I'm like, "Alrighty, nice day we're having, isn't it?"
You know, we in the Mid-County one, we did include multiple groups of projects. Group 1 was the baseline, the projects of conservation and pumping redistribution that we're already doing. Group 2 is our plan to get us to sustainability, so ASR and the Pure Water Self-Help project. We included a Group 3 that are conceptual project ideas that we may need to turn to if those group 2 projects don't work out, and we do specifically mention direct potable reuse as one of those, noting that it's not a possibility now, but that both technology is going to change, laws are going to change in the next 20 years, and we didn't want it to be off the table in case it turns out to be something we want to pursue later on and it's not in our GSP, so we can't use it.
Other questions from the board? Jack?
I like that idea because I'm sitting here thinking, okay, if we have too many of these actions, it can get expensive, it can get difficult, it can get hard to reach them all. So the simplicity of very few makes sense, and yet we want it to be effective. So I recognize even if we got a few, it may not be effective. So I like the idea of other backup measures, I guess, if needed.
Any last call from board members? I'm going to hand it over to Chris to start working with public questions. Ready? Okay, Chris, I hand it to you for public.
Okay. Our brain trust out there. What do you guys think?
So I was listening to the description of the LID, where you're getting rid of all vegetation and you're containing the water underground and directing all the runoff into that. And my thought is, we've got redwood trees that are sequestering carbon and they are drawing water up, but then they also provide cooling and shade. So when you walk under redwood trees, you notice the ground is wet, right? Months after the last rain. So they are a water storage facility, and it doesn't cost anything other than to not cut them down. And I think that it's really important in our watershed to preserve and value what we already have, which is not an added expense. Now, I really, like the idea of those underground storage facilities. And I think in an emergency, if you had to go toilet to tap, or from
We don't say that.
Yeah. But a lot of us are already using bottled water because the water that comes out of our tap is so full of minerals that it ruins our appliances. So in an emergency, people can go get bottled water and use the tap water for washing and irrigating and whatever else they need to do. So it's just a different way of thinking about what comes out of the tap. And I know the state's mandating that you should be able to drink that water, but what happens in an emergency if the pipes break and, we're all going to be scrambling for water and we're not going to be questioning, is it really drinkable, right? We're just going to boil it and we're going to use it. So that was just one of my suggestions. I like distributed solutions, like slow down those creeks. I see in San Lorenzo River, every year it carves out more and more of the bank. We're losing, it's widening, it's deepening because it's coming too fast. We need ways to slow it down. Fall Creek, they've been letting the logs create fish habitat and slow down the runoff rather than letting all that water just rush out to the ocean.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Okay, thank you. Dave? Okay.
We're done.
Okay. Well, that's a lot, though.
This is right. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Dave. Okay. My head's full. Staff report. Legal counsel. Terry.
I have nothing tonight.
Okay. Wow. Financial report that's in here from the period of October 1st to December 31st. Did I do that? I skipped it. Hold on, I'm sorry. Lois is pointing out.
I think you're good.
No, I'm good, right? Okay. Financial report. Anything about the financial report that's included?
Slightly new format. You might have noticed that we have grouped the expenditures differently just to make them and assign numbers to them. just to make it a little bit easier and to process. But the number, it's a good milestone, six month, half year into the year, so you can
Right.
get a sense of what we have spent so far and brought in.
Okay, any questions or comments, Doug?
Commendation on the format and content. I did have a question on 5.2-7. It's not impertinent, noting that SLD and Scotts Valley show deposits. Are all of our JPA members current with their deposits?
No.
The county's working on paying it. It takes a long time to process a payment at the county, but it's in for payment at this point.
In for, that check's not even in the mail.
I just checked my budget to see if it had been paid out of my budget yet, and it has not, but it should be within the next 2 weeks.
Thanks.
Any other questions from the board? Yes.
Personally, I'd like to see a bit more detail on the credit card. I just feel like oversight, we should be seeing what that $1,000 or so a month is made up of, and I don't need every single line. I mean, just copying the charge card statement would be sufficient for me.
Any, off the top, what do we use the credit card for mostly?
It's usually the meals for these events or some of the different meetings and stuff like that. When I enter it in, it goes itemized, and when it shows up on here, it's a summary, so I could probably break it out manually.
Okay, thank you, Ruth. Anyone else? Okay, any comment from anyone from the public about the financial? Okay, administrative, Pira?
I have two quick ones. Those were both questions or comments from prior board meetings from the board. First was when I brought to you, I think it was October, that the contract with Miller Maxfield was running quite a bit over. It's just to extrapolate the whole over year, and you wanted 6 months the status where it is. So we are actually 7 months because we're almost end of January. They have spent 23,000 out of 35, so there's still 12,000 there. So at this point, the staff does not recommend any change orders or additions to that budget. And then the other one, that was a question from last board meetings, that we had the annual financials for fiscal year 2019 in the board packet. And there is also prior year there, so the director had noticed that the cost share was different in 2018, and that is true. That was the first year, and the first year we used a slightly different cost split, so it was 53% from Scotts Valley, 39% from San Lorenzo, and 8% from the county. And it was just something that to get this organization built and the first budget done, we used numbers that seemed to be pretty fair allocation based on pumping in 2012. It was single year only. And then when we developed the following year budget, we decided to actually be a little bit more inclusive. So we did average of 2008 through 2016. In the south zone, we looked at 2015-16 basin-wide pumping, and then we adjusted the return flow from septic systems in the county area. So if we added all those together, this cost split came 60 to Scotts Valley, 30 to San Lorenzo, and 10 to county. And then the decision was made to keep it the same, not to move it around every single year, but keep it the same for the rest of the GSP development phase until 2022, and then recalibrate to see what is more fair, or should the same split be kept going forward. So that's all I have.
Lois has a question.
I have to live up to today's assessment of me. Okay, I've been looking at the Miller Maxfield items on financial report, now what you said. It seems excessive to me. And I mean, I don't really know, like in SLB, we've got 2/3 of the people that are in the audience are from SLB. And yet, they aren't getting very much information somehow. So where is his information going out? How is it percolating, so to speak, down to people in SLV or Scotts Valley or whatever? I just don't know where it's going.
Well, a big component of that contract is the CNE, Community Engagement Plan, that section in the GSP. So that is
Right.
something that is not necessarily outward. Directed activity, but it's a requirement of SIGMA that the GSP has to include a plan component that talks about the community outreach in theory. So they have been working on that. And otherwise it's cyclical. They do keep our Facebook up and our work with the Scotts Valley staff to do their website. So this is certainly something that is there. Also at times, for example, when we did the tours, facing tours, there was much more. They helped to put together the package. They also have been behind all of those poster boards. So if there's anything specific that the board would like to direct them, we can certainly add them, add that activity. But they're doing, by and large, what was in the original contract, and happy to take input from the board.
I guess what I'm saying.
Let me just interrupt for a second. But what you were saying before is we're not going over budget this year.
I don't expect to go over budget, so it's a.
I heard that,
Okay.
but still, it seems like an extreme amount of money to me. Sorry, this is my opinion, and I'm not really seeing results. Okay, there were the tours. You're talking about a website now? Did you say a website?
Well, website and Facebook are both two social media vehicles that the agency uses, and somebody needs to work with both of those platforms to keep them up to date and make sure.
Well, I would love to see a really good list of what is driving those numbers.
This is something that we used to have in a board packet, and I plan to continue putting it there every month, but since November and December we did not have a whole lot of activity, there was no reason to just add a piece of paper there. So we certainly keep it up, having them to bring the status reports to that and put in the board packet. So I'll make sure that happens.
Anything from the public? Okay. Well, you're on then. You want to discuss that? No more, that was your part. I got it. Okay. Individual directors' reports.
All right.
Lois is on.
Okay, I'm going to be on. I think a lot of you know that people in SLV are very interested in what's going on here. Of course, there's a huge number that really don't care and don't have a clue and don't care. But we do have a lot of comment from people coming to meetings. So we had a meeting last Thursday. It was very basic. I don't want to bore everybody because it's very basic and you know about it, but just let me tell you what happened at that meeting, what we talked about. We talked about sorry, I'm having trouble with it, how Sigma came about. Well, we had the huge drought in 2012 to 2016, and the state legislature passed a groundwater sustainability Management Act in 2014, and it was the first comprehensive framework for groundwater in the state of California. And I'm thinking there were other western states that were ahead of us on this, but it preserved, as Dave was saying, local control, management, and accountability of groundwater in each basin. So I'm not going to go too much into this. We went over the map, so to speak, the groundwater map. How does it apply to the basin? And how did we become a moderate overdrafted or basin? Well, our score, based on the 6 criteria, my understanding is 16.5. So, tell me if I'm wrong. Moderate is 14 to 40. And we're just barely in the moderate. And the things that brought ours up to 16.5 was public supply wells, a score of 4, total supply wells, score of 5, groundwater reliance score, 3.5, and then there were a couple of other things that aren't in the red, a 2 for population score and 2 for groundwater impact score. And then we were shown basically a roadmap of what's going to happen in 2020. There's a lot of things that are going to happen, and one of the reasons this is so basic is because all the big items are going to be happening, let's say, in the next year and a half, since Dave said we better be done by the middle of 2021. So the question was asked, what if we don't comply? It costs us a whole lot of money, a big problem. I'm not going to go into that. So the question was asked, how much of SLV is in the basin? Well, the basin is about 35 square miles. 12 square miles of SLV are in the basin. SLV is overall 61 square miles. 12 square miles of that is in the basin. So that means that if we're 12% of the 35, I mean not 12 square miles of the 35 square miles, it's about 35% of SLV is in the basin. There are a lot of different questions that were asked. They were pretty much water management areas. Okay, you know that's my question because I brought that up before. There are various things that can create a management area, but bottom line, if there is a management area, we're still part of the overall basin requirements. And if there is a management area, we can't cause problems outside of the management area. So there's controls on management areas. Potential issues of concerns for district participation are identifying who benefits and who pays. Uh-oh, there's my thing. Sorry, Dave. Monitoring costs, groundwater, surface water, and GDEs, which I had to scratch my head on both sides about what GDEs are, but it's, I wrote it down here somewhere, but I lost it. Anyway, then reporting costs every 5 years, projected actions and management costs, identify potential district and or regional projects to support basin sustainability, and perhaps use of Loch Lomond, position basin for future GSP grant funding. And that I did that as fast as I could, and I left out a whole bunch, but you get the idea.
How was the attendance?
It was pretty good attendance. Yeah, well, we have a lot of attendance at our meetings.
Right.
And, I mean, we got several people out there, and Chuck is shaking his head. We're just interested. I mean, we want to know what we're doing and why we're doing it and how it benefits everybody.
That's a great contribution to our public outreach. That's great.
Yeah, I think.
Put that in the report.
You know, I think it's up to us to make it clear. And having been involved in two, one was Measure D in transportation, to put that formula together so everybody was on board. It wasn't that every agency got what they wanted, it was every facet of transportation got a piece of the pie too. And then with Monterey Bay Community Power, to get, well, now we're going to be 31 agencies pretty soon in 5 counties. You just have to give and take, and it's a lot of communication. And we have to communicate. We don't know what our plan is yet, but as Dave said, you know, we've got to get our act together. Everybody's got to benefit from this, and we are the ones that are going to have to see it happen. It's up to us. That's what I think.
Thank you, Lois. Any other director reports? Any director of travel or training coming up that anyone wants to tell us about? There is a water reuse conference coming up.
And also the summit. I know some of you are planning, months and months ahead. So that 3rd annual groundwater GSA or GSP or whatever it's acronym summit is happening in early June. It's the dates in your work packet, so reach out to Nick if any of you are interested in either more information or would like to sign up. It's been very, very beneficial for the people who attended last 2 times.
6.2 correspondence request from individual directors.
This was something that we received 2 written requests, staff did, from board members to include something in a future board package. So we wanted to make sure, just full transparency, that you see what the requests were. And in terms of the population and how that might drive some of the decisions this board has to make, this is in February, going to be part of your board agenda, is we will be discussing how population impacts or relates to demand, and then how demand relates to or impacts water management decisions. So we will be talking about this, and the board can give more direction and input to staff, how to include the scenarios that you might want to consider in the model runs in the future. And the other one was about climate and how, again, which scenarios should be included in the model. And I do believe that is something that you will be coming, the consultants will be coming to us anyway, and kind of getting board feedback of which scenarios to include.
And just for any director, if, I would think that during individual directors' reports, if there's anything that, pops into your head that you would like to see on a future agenda, you could always voice it there, then and there. Just
both ways.
Without talking about it, you just mention this is what. Yeah, definitely correspondence are good too. Board compliance, I think everyone's in compliance. Okay. Anything, future items, et cetera, informational items, the event calendar.
That brings us to number 10.
Before that.
Oh, go.
The, Perrette, you had us read this one about the cast gym, and I was wondering if you had it included just to show us what kind of bureaucratic language and obfuscation goes on, because I had to read this sucker so many times out of the blue. It was, it was nasty.
Yeah, just again, to full transparency, some of the communication correspondence that gets sent to this agency, because this agency has really no staff to do. So I get those as a business agent on your behalf, and I figured the least I can do is to share it with you.
You're so selfless.
Okay, that would bring us to number 10.
I move adjournment.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming out, spending your time with us. It's nice to see people again.
Yeah.